Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here at this policy dialogue in the context of the Horizons 2020 Habitable project. Today, we'll be discussing climate change, habitability, and human rights. And this is our technical session in which we will be having presentations from our project researchers and consortium members. Tomorrow, we'll discuss then the policy implications. I'm Claire Hathaway. I'm from the Management of Social Transformation and Foresight program of UNESCO, one of the project partners. And without further ado, I would like to hand the floor to François Gemène, the director of the Hugo Observatory at the University of Liège and the principal investigator for the Habitable project. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thanks a lot to all of you for your presence today. I won't be very long, but I wanted in a few minutes to introduce some of the key concepts and principles that really underpin the work we're doing at the Habitable project. As probably many of you already know, Habitable is dedicated to the study of the interactions between climate impacts and the migration decision. It is a relatively large 4-year-long project associating 21 partners, not only partners from Europe, but also partners from Africa and from Asia. And this project is funded by the European Commission. I think that one of the key innovation or originality of this project is that unlike many other projects that have touched upon the climate migration nexus, this one is really positioned at the micro level, at the household level, with a view to understanding how the migration decision is being made. In other words, we will not seek to make large-scale projections, but rather understand how, at the household level, the decision to migrate or to stay is being made. And for this, we're hoping to develop a predictive understanding of the migration trends under climate change that will allow us to better design adaptation policies that will account for the way climate impacts are perceived by local people, and to develop beyond adaptation policies that would better address the migration patterns associated with climate change. And this is the reason why we're organizing this event today and the policy dialogue tomorrow as part of the human rights session at the Palais des Nations, in order to share some of the key preliminary findings and insights from Habitable, and to basically discuss it with the wider research and policy community of which you are, of course, part of. Of course, the following presentations will detail a little bit more on the methods we're using, on the key findings that we've obtained so far. But as of now, I wanted to highlight some of the key innovations that really are central to the project. The first one is that the project recognizes the social dimension of habitability, and therefore it seeks to break away from the physical determination of habitability, which is usually obtained by climate models. If one looks today what the public debates around inhabitability look like, most of it centers around the results of models that this region or that region will become uninhabitable in the next 10, 20, or 30 years because of rising temperatures or because of rising sea levels. We certainly do not deny the reality of these, but we insist in Habitable on the way that such impacts will be perceived in a subjective fashion by the local population. And therefore, these impacts will also be mitigated by the way they will be perceived by local populations. And therefore, what we want to recognize in this project is that habitability is not a physical, objective concept, but it is also a social subjective one. Therefore, recognizing, acknowledging for the social dimension of habitability is one of the first endeavor and innovation, dare I say, of this project. Therefore, we will focus on the household level rather than on the big numbers. That's a major deviation of this project compared to many other projects conducted in the field. As I said, the project also highlights the role of subjective perceptions of these climate impacts, but also of the risks and opportunities associated with these impacts. We were struck by the fact that in some regions, in some periods, the way climate impacts were perceived was actually pretty different from what they were in reality, and that the perception of local populations sometimes was different, if not contrary, to actual observation of these impacts. And I think that the project recognizes that local perceptions do not always match the observations, and that such perceptions have to be accounted for if we are to design sound policies that respond to the needs of local populations. Third, innovation is about the non-linearity of the social changes associated with the climate impacts. Too often, we assume there is a direct linear relationship between the magnitude of the climate impact and the magnitude of the social change that is associated with this impact. In Habitable, we contend that there is no direct linear relationship between the magnitude of climate impacts and the magnitude or amplitude of the social changes that are associated with these impacts. In other words, in a highly resilient society or community, a major climate impact can induce only small social change, whereas in other communities, at other times, with other people, even a small climate impact can induce major social transformations. And in order to apprehend this non-linearity, we use the concept of social tipping point, which was recently introduced in the latest installment of the IPCC reports. And the concept of social tipping point insists that the social transformation associated with a specific type of climate impact depend a lot on the resilience and adaptive capacity of the given society. Therefore, it is not possible to identify social tipping points in a uniform fashion. All are very much context dependent, and this is the reason why it is absolutely essential, of course, that we conduct studies at the local level in order to understand how populations perceive these impacts, but also how they perceive the risks and opportunities associated with migration. The methods we're using rely on an approach that is systems-based when it comes to migration and ecosystems. In other words, we will not consider that there is just one area of origin and one area of destination, but that on the contrary, those migration flows constitute a migration system. And what we want to study is this system and how the migration flows within this system interact with the ecosystems. The approach we're using is also very much gender sensitive. This gender dimension is present throughout the project, and we insist on the fact that gender is not just about identifying the specific vulnerabilities of women, but more broadly to identify the gender interactions and how these interactions between genders are affected by the impacts of climate change, but also by migration flows. And how do these interactions change the relationship between both sexes? Finally, our approach is also a comparative approach. We're working in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, also in Thailand, and therefore our goal is really not to pile up case studies after case studies, but really to use a uniform methodology across the different case studies in order to build a strong comparative approach that will allow us further to develop a predictive understanding of the climate migration relationship. We combine quantitative with qualitative methods. Our key quantitative methods being a large-scale household survey that will be organized in 2 waves across 5 countries with about 1,000 respondents per country. So this is a very significant survey, and we complement these quantitative data with some qualitative data using rather innovative methods such as fuzzy cognitive mapping, which is a qualitative method that allows us to basically map the perceptions and expectations of local populations. On this basis, afterwards, we will be producing some models that will account for both quantitative and qualitative variables, and some scenarios that will seek to reconcile the current actual evidence with the future projections. And I think that in our models and scenarios, we will really try to reconcile both quantitative and qualitative approaches, both current evidence and future projections. And I think that in itself is rather innovative. Another strong and important component of the project is the engagement with different stakeholders. You are, of course, part of these stakeholders. Hello, Michelle. And we also want to connect, of course, with the local stakeholders in the different countries. So it is the reason why our partners in Africa and in Asia have been associated from the very outset of the project. They are not just subcontractors, as it is the case in too many projects, but they were really associated to the redesign of the methods of the project. And we will be conducting some stakeholder events, including an exhibition in the different countries where we conduct field work in order to maximize the potential of appropriation of the work by local population and local authorities, but also to make sure that the stakeholders are really fully engaged in the research and that the research project is also their research project and not just our research project. And of course, that is a very important dimension in the project as well. As I said, it does associate 21 partners. I'm afraid we will not have the possibility to hear from all of them today and tomorrow, but still, we have an afternoon to hear from at least some of them covering different aspects of the project. So I will let you introduce them, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois. Our next remarks will be coming from Sergio Marchisio, the Professor of International Law at the Sapienza University of Rome.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm here not to present the results of our working package 6, but to say a few words to co-open this technical session of the Habitable Policy Dialogue held on today and tomorrow here in Geneva and organized in the context of the Habitable EU project. I'm here co-opening this session because tomorrow we will have a policy dialogue at the United Nations on the nexus between habitability, climate change, and human rights, and we will listen to some experts in the field working at the United Nations. You know that the UN bodies, particularly the Human Rights Council, have been addressing this issue since 2008, when the Council expressed its concern for the first time. This is the same that the General Assembly did with the climate concern as a common concern of humankind. And in 2008, I repeat, the Council expressed its concern about the immediate and the far-reaching threat represented by climate change. Then we had the appointment of a special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, and the title of its first report, delivered this April, is providing legal options to protect the human rights of persons displaced across international borders due to climate change. Now, there is, of course, a narrative about climate change and human rights, and the most usual way of addressing this issue is to say, there are no norms of international law, we should fill the gap, we should adopt some kind of international convention. And the debate is around, or has been around, the definition of a new legal class of climate refugees. This way of thinking is not necessarily the most useful, I think, because we know very much that at that stage it is quite impossible to have any kind of legally binding instruments on refugees, starting from the climate refugees, starting from the Convention on Refugees, UN Convention on Refugees, the revision of it, or a new legal instruments. As Francois said, in many occasions, the definition of what is a climate migrant is very difficult, and the definition is key in any legal exercise. If you want to have some legal instrument, you should define what the addressees are of these measures that refer to the protection of climate changes. And there is also a rising concern about the impossibility of identifying any causal pattern between climate change, conflict, and migration. And this is why even the International Organization for Migration has presented a certain skepticism about this way. Now, we have, being inside the Habitable project as a whole, our working package 6, which is about legal and policy issues, and in order to find some policy recommendations for institutions and other subjects that have to deal with this problem, we started with the premise that the understanding habitability is very important also from the legal point of view, and we tried to see how we can use these notions within a human rights-based approach. In fact, habitability is a precondition for the effective enjoyment of fundamental rights and for living a life with dignity. This is not only our point of view, but it has been included in many decisions of international bodies dealing with human rights, such as the UN Human Rights Committee and the UN Human Rights Council. The recognition that objective habitability determines the need for the adoption of preventive and protective measures. So we have focused the policy dialogue to reach a broader range of actors, experts, and practitioners to seek their views, raise awareness, and assess policy solution. As far as we are concerned, we identified in a policy brief called Tackling Climate Migration and Human Rights in Tandem, a policy agenda of last April 2023, 30 policy options. And of course, this is a very broad range of policy options that try to cover 5 main areas. The first one is because we think that all of them are involved with the human rights approach, and not only the protection of migrants from countries which are threatened by climate adverse consequences, mitigation of climate change, adaptation to adverse effect of global warming, loss and damage from climate change, internal and cross-border climate mobility, and climate displacement. We will discuss them tomorrow more in detail, but I'm sure that already today, during this technical session, we will learn a lot, and we will share knowledge and about these preliminary results of the project to discuss them tomorrow as from the point of view of the policy implications. I think that we will make progress toward the achievement of the objective of the project with this 2 days engagement in Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And finally, I'd like to hand the floor to Yulia Shevchuk, the Chief of Section ad interim for the Management of Social Transformations and Foresight Program of UNESCO.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me well? Well,
yes.
Oh, good. Welcome to this workshop. Thank you for having us here. Let me be brief so as to leave enough time for the interesting discussions and the technical discussions to follow. Let me start by saying that we come here from the UNESCO Management of Social Transformations Program. That is an intergovernmental program mandated by all countries, all member states since 1993 to improve the nexus between knowledge and policy. And we do that on a number of topics, all falling under the issue of reduction of inequalities in their various types and forms: social, economic, political, spatial, knowledge, and of course, environmental. So that is a long way to say that we exist here, and our raison d'etre is to improve knowledge policy nexus and the imprint of knowledge on policy for a positive social change. Within this context, we had the honor and the pleasure of being from the very beginning partners within the HABITABLE consortium. And my colleagues who just spoke already underlined the importance of HABITABLE and the uniqueness of the project. Let me go a bit further down that path to say that HABITABLE is absolutely crucial because you and we really fill the gaps, the stringent, the pressing gaps in knowledge on climate migration. However, it doesn't stop here. It goes a step further to make sure that whatever knowledge you produce on this critical topic actually penetrates policy, actually has an impact on action. Basically, to make sure that there is a proper link between what we know and how we worked upon it on this critical topic of climate-induced migration. So we are happy to be here with you today. We see this event as critical, being involved deeply in the stakeholder engagement work package and in policy knowledge dialogue within the project. We think this event is a very, very important step in that direction. I am not there with you, obviously, but my colleague Claire is responsible within our program within UNESCO for HABITABLE and will be with you through and through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. And now we'd like to get started with the presentations from our consortium members. We're going to begin with the methodology and preliminary findings portion with Karim Zantut, who's here. He's a postdoctoral researcher at PIK Potsdam, and he will be discussing the development of global international migration models for scenario building.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, so I will be showing like some developments on global international migration models, and we are like specifically here in Geneva. Yeah, so the home of the Geneva Refugee Convention, and we are funded by the EU. I can't abstain from at least shortly mentioning the human rights violations that are taking place at the European border. So we have like pushbacks, but also those controlled, close controlled access centers, which we always have to keep in mind as scientists working in this field. So, but now let's move on to the overview of my talk. So first, I would like to introduce like the whole approach in itself when we want to model international migration, and then I will want to present to you two different distinct approaches that one can have on this topic, namely deterministic approaches, but also stochastic ones, and then coming to the development of a new stochastic evolution model that we developed to get like the best of those two worlds. And then in the end, I would like to sum up and show an outlook how we will proceed. So first of all, to the introduction, quantifying international migration is very difficult, and this has like several reasons. So first of all, there's no universal definition of migrant or migration. It always depends on which field you're talking about, and then the definition will vary. So as Sergio mentioned, in law, we need like a precise definition to work on it, and this is like the same also in research, but depending on which field you work on, you will get like different definitions, which make it hard to compare data. Next, we have like a restricted resolution in the data, or the data is even incomplete. Like for certain countries, we're missing data, and the resolution might be also restricted. For example, if you take UN diaspora data, we have like only a 5-year resolution data. If we take OECD data, we have a yearly resolution, but the number of countries is limited. So we have like restrictions there. Also, the data is typically given in terms of diaspora sizes, but not in terms of bilateral migration flows. But these are like the ones which we need as ingredients to make like a proper modeling. So we have to rely on certain approaches and assumptions to have these as an ingredient. And I show you here now 6 approaches where one can take the diaspora sizes and produce from them bilateral migration flows. And as you can see, they are rather different. So each color represents one approach, and all the 6 are quite different, not only quantitatively, but qualitatively. And this is like an additional challenge that we face when we model international migration. The next aspect is the mechanism of international migration. We know that migration is a very complex phenomenon that we can see, and it has like several dimensions going from demographical to social, economic, political, and historical ones. And if you want to quantify that, we have to be like very cautious, because some of these aspects are very easy, or like at least easier to quantify. For example, economic aspects or demographic, we can have just numbers. But how do we deal with qualitative factors such as colonial ties or aspirations? And this is like difficult, and we have to find a way to deal with that. And another aspect that was already also mentioned by Francois is like this nonlinear behavior. So even if we understood like a certain parameter range and we think that this is like applicable, it might be that if we move further in this parameter range that we find a different behavior. And this is important, for example, for the so-called migration hump, which is highly debatable, that I want to show you like here in this figure. So this migration hump theory suggests that there is some nonlinear relationship between the relative migration flow and the per capita GDP, and then you see like this hump-like shape. But as you can see, so this is like a nonlinear behavior, obviously. But as you can also see, many of the data points lie above and below these lines. So this is like why this is debated, for example. And we have to be like very cautious when using this kind of theory approaches, and we have to mind the framing, because this can be misused for certain agents. So let's move on to the modeling approaches. So now that we have seen the limitations, we have to somehow find an approach to still make a good quantitative predictions for the future. And there are like 2 different approaches that one can single out, so deterministic ones and stochastic ones. Let me first explain to you a bit about the deterministic models. The most common ones are regression models, and this means that you have like a migration rate between, for example, country I and country A, or for region I and region J, and this is like given as a function of certain variables. For example, in this case, I show you this example where it's dependent on GI, DIJ, and PI. This could be, for example, GDP, the distance between the 2 countries, or the population. And then if you take those parameters, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and you fit them to match the data, you get like a complete migration model, and it's deterministic because once you know all the parameters, you can include the variables and get like a precise number which tells you how the migration rates look like. The problem with that is that you make implicit assumptions about the migration channels because you have your variables and those determine the migration channels that you have picked. And these kind of approach can be shown to be good at reproducing the data in general. So I show you here, for example, 4 different regression models. The complexity increases from 1 to 4, so we have more variables. And if you look at the R² value, you see that it increases from 0.62 in the first model up to 0.95 in the most complex model. So we would say this is a very good R² value, so we have the feeling that we understood something. But if you look at the time series and compare the different time series that happen, that occur, then we see that the R² value is actually very far away from 1. So this means that these kind of approaches might not be useful if you want to make predictions for the future and understand what's going on when it comes to time dependency. So let's move on to the stochastic models. The approach here is a bit different because in that approach we try to model migration in terms of stochastic processes. So in this very simple example that no one would actually use in practice, we just sample it from a uniform distribution. So we just take migration rates and sample them in terms of a uniform distribution. And the idea about that is that if we don't know certainly what's going on, it's better to use like a stochastic approach to account for this unknown. The problem with these kind of approaches is that they are not easily interpretable. So we are moving now in the realm of stochastic approaches. So we have to deal with probabilities, mean values, variances, and all that. And this is like some kind of limitation that we have now. But on the other hand, typically those stochastic approaches reflect the data structure quite good. So if we have like missing data, or if we have like not very precise or very perfect correlation, then stochastic approaches are actually good at representing that. And here's an example how this can look like. So here we show like the migration rates. So the black curve is how they have been in the past for some example country. And the red shaded area gives like the different scenarios that can be produced by a more elaborate stochastic model. And we see the problem is that after a couple of years, the different trajectories fan out very broadly. So after, for example, if we look at 2050, we can't actually really say whether migration rates might be negative or even positive. And this is like a limitation of these stochastic approaches. So what do we do now? So we have seen that stochastic approaches can account for certain things, but on the other hand, deterministic approaches are more precise when it comes to proper numbers. So we try to merge those two approaches and get something new. And this is like what we do in our stochastic evolution model. And the motivation is, as I told you, like to take the best of both worlds to account for the unknown that we cannot settle down, but for the things that we know, we want to express them as precise as possible. And this is like motivated, for example, within stochastic differential equations where the approach is also used. So the method, how does it work? We have like 2 components. The first deterministic one is when it comes to time projection. So if you ask me how the population in the next year will look like, so pj plus 1, then you just take the population from the last year and you scale it with birth and death rates. This is cy. And then you have to account for also assimilation and migration processes. This is ay and my. But those 2 processes are stochastic because we cannot settle down on all the details of that. So we treat them as stochastic variables that enter our equations. So they are given by certain probability distributions which have parameters. For example, the migration has mu m, sigma m, and the assimilation has mu a and sigma a. And those parameters are fitted to data to get them close to what we actually observe. And if you want like a graphical representation of that model, I can show it here to you for an example where we have only 3 countries. We have like the population and the diasporas, so P and D, and they are connected by means of flows, namely migration flows M, return flows R, and assimilation flows A, and those are treated stochastically. And then the counting of that is done by means of the deterministic equations that I've shown you before. So let's move on to the more fun part, maybe the preliminary results. So first of all, the question arises, does it actually work? So if we have like this data and we want to fit it to probability distributions, can we actually do that? And what we see here on the left-hand side is actually that it works quite well. So here's an example for migration rates. And then we take the data, this is like the blue histograms in the background, and we try to fit it to probability density function. And we see for countries with mid-size, we see that the fit is actually quite well. And only in the cases where the populations are rather small or large, this is like the upper left and the bottom right one, we see that the fit is maybe not perfect. But that is due to the fact that we don't have many countries who have actually large or very small population sizes. So this works actually quite well. And how does it actually look like in practice? So here I just show you the assimilation process. So as a function of t on the x-axis, we show how diaspora evolves as a function of time. And we see for the mean assimilation that in the beginning it's like rather constant, and then it increases and saturates at some point. But these are only the mean values. So what is actually happening in the background is a stochastic process. So we have like those gray lines which show different scenarios, and only like the colored lines are the mean values that we have in the variance. And as you can see, they can be highly non-trivial and can be very different. And with that respect, we account for this unknown that we can not actually perfectly know quantitatively how assimilation works. The second, and I would say this is like the most important result of this model, is when we look at the international migration stock and we start at 1990 and we evolve in future 30 years up to 2020, then we get like this red line. And if we compare it like to the observed migration data given by UN data, for example, we see that this is actually quite close. And the bars that you can see above and below are like the standard deviation for the data. So we don't have like a big fanning out, and the mean value is already close to the observed data. And now you might ask, okay, why do we use this very complex approach and do all the stochastic sampling? Why don't we just take like the mean value from the very beginning? So instead of using the probability density functions, why don't we just take the mean value and do the evolution? And the answer is given on the left-hand side. This is like the result is the red line then. We see that it's actually much worse compared to that. So the evolution shows in the very beginning actually a decline in migration stock, and then it increases afterwards. But it's further away from that than what we see if we only use a stochastic approach. So we see that actually these whole interdependencies that can be somehow mapped within those stochastic approaches are lost if we just use a purely deterministic approach. And with that, I would like to come to my summary and to the outlook. So I've shown you like this new stochastic evolution model for international migration, and we're currently writing things up. And the next step, and this is like also coming back to what have been mentioned earlier. So far we are like still on the very global level, but we want really to dig down and go deeper into the regional level and take those properties also into account. And these are like the next steps. And for that, actually, this approach is very, very flexible and very good, because with this stochastic approaches, we have these parameters to feed in information without being very precise on numbers, actually. So to make this connection between quantitative and qualitative is actually very good when you have like this kind of approaches where we have those stochastic elements inside. And yeah, having done that, we will also start then to develop future scenarios within this framework. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karim. We're now going to open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you have any questions about this presentation, now is the moment. Yes.
Hello, I'm Caroline from...
Sorry, here's the microphone.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Caroline. I'm from the GIZ Global Program, Human Mobility in the Context of Climate Change in Bonn. Can you hear me? It's okay? All right. I can shout.
I think you need to read.
Hello. Hello. Okay. I'm not sure. Okay. I'm from the GIZ Global Program, Human Mobility in the Context of Climate Change in Bonn. Thank you for the invitation and for the really clear presentation. I have a question and a relative to the question. So the question is, you said you're sampling or modeling in sub-Saharan Africa, and relative to the question is, are you doing West Africa? And if yes, are you also working with regional organizations or with specific countries, individual countries? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So far, the data that we're using are like on a global level. So we take only country data into account. account, and we don't use that much data when it comes to specific regional contexts. But this will come like later because we want then to improve our model. But first of all, we wanted to see whether this actually works because it's a very new approach where you combine like those two different stochastic and deterministic approaches. So we wanted to see it like on a global scale whether it works. And once this is settled down and we see that it's actually very promising, we will go down to regional data, and then like Sub-Saharan Africa or Western Africa, we will for sure treat like separately and take also qualitative, quantitative data and see in how far we can include it, especially when it comes to assimilation processes, for example, but even like the migration processes. Yeah.
Okay, I'll speak close to the mic. Good afternoon, Jeremy Lee. I work here at UNOPS at the Lives in Dignity Grant Facility. One question that I have is if you could make for me the connection with the presentation from François Gemel at the beginning, where he highlighted that the project is very much focused on the household level. So how your approach, which seems to me very statistical and global, connects with this household level. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Jane Lineker from the Mixed Migration Centre. My question relates to that a little bit. It's to understand a little bit more about the assumptions and the variables that you're using in the modelling, that you're talking about qualitative aspects, and yeah, how does it speak to household and assimilation and stuff like that? Thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you for these questions. Yeah, it's absolutely legitimate to ask that. So what we are doing so far is just like to start like from a top-bottom approach. So if you first like try to get as much as like concise and globally applicable data as possible. This is like why we start like on a global level and try to use as few variables as possible. So this refers like to your question maybe. So we take so far on like mostly population data and diaspora-sized data to have like as few assumptions as possible and to have like data where we know that the error bars are not too big to introduce not too many errors in the beginning. But the stochastic approach, so since we have like probability distributions that we have in the very end, we can actually connect it very well to survey data, for example, that François mentioned that we have like survey data. So in the end, if you quantify it and you have like distributions in the very end, we can use them to somehow try to map it and to fit our parameters also connected to the surveys, the results of the surveys. So this is what I mentioned in the very end, that it's actually a very flexible approach and can combine very well with qualitative research, because of the stochastic element in it. Thanks.
Thank you for these questions. Are there any last questions for this presentation? If not, I would like to thank Karim again for his excellent presentation, and now open the floor to Fleur Gubert. She's a senior researcher at the Institut de Recherche pour le Développement, and she is giving a presentation on the long-term analysis of links between climate events and migration in Mali. The floor is yours, Fleur.
Right. Thank you very much. Can you see the slide and can you hear me?
Yes and yes.
Good. Okay. So thanks for offering me the opportunity to present this research, which is a joint work with Dimitri de France and Esther de Le Salle. So as you will see...
Excuse me, Fleur, would you mind speaking perhaps a little bit louder?
Okay. Is that better now? Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, so it's a rather different perspective from the previous presentation, which provided an analysis at the global level. Here, it's a case study where we illustrate or we try to put to test the concept of habitability defined by François, right? So here, as François said, habitability is assumed not to depend solely on climate parameters, but also on a number of factors that affect how people perceive the habitability of the area they reside in, their vulnerability combined with the vulnerability of their place of residence, their agency in migration decision, and so on, right? So, oh, sorry, I tried to, yeah. So, so what we do here is we assess whether and to what extent climate anomalies in Mali have generated additional internal and international migratory flows in this country, right? So we not only try to assess whether there is a link between climate events and migration, but also our aim is to investigate whether there is heterogeneity in migration responses to climate anomalies. So the question we try to answer is not only did climate anomalies end up in increased mobility, but also under which conditions did climate anomalies translate into increased mobility. And then we use our results based on recent decades to anticipate what might happen in the future. So Mali is obviously an interesting case to focus on for several reasons, right? The first reason is related to the fact that Mali's economy heavily relies on agriculture, right? If one considers both crop producers on the one hand and livestock breeders on the other hand, if we consider both groups together, no less than 2/3 of the population is still engaged in agriculture. The second trait is the fact that agriculture in Mali is mostly rain-fed, okay, and hence crop production is still highly dependent on rainfall, right? So we expect any climate event to have a strong impact on agricultural income. The third specificity of Mali is the fact that given its size, the country is characterized by a diversity of agroecological zones referred to as the desert, the Sahelian, and the Sudanese zones, with very different level of precipitation per year, which makes it possible to test for difference in migratory responses to climate events, depending on affected individuals' place of residence. So what do we do in this research? We use population data that we take from the 3 latest population and housing censuses conducted in Mali in 87, 98, and 2009. And what we do is that we rely on population increments between censuses at a highly disaggregated level to infer net migration rates. And we combine this data with climate data in order to assess the influence of weather anomalies on migration patterns. In addition, we use a module that has been added to the 2009 census, which allows us to compute international migration rates at this highly disaggregated level. As our main climate indicator, we use then the SPEI, which is the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, which is a combination of a rainfall index, temperature, and evapotranspiration, that is the ability of the soil to retain water. And so this SPEI index takes all these into account, right? This index is expressed in standard deviation above or below historical values in a given location. Okay, so that means that if this index is below 0, we are in a situation where we have a drier year than usual, right? While when this index is higher than 0, we have a wetter year than usual. Okay, and so we will consider in this paper that we have a drought when this index is less than -1. Okay. So just to give you a quick overview of the situation in Mali. Okay, so this figure displays the average SPEI values for Mali over quite a long period, ranging from 1967 to 2009. So as you can see, there are very large fluctuations over the period, right? With a clear dominance of dry events. Anomalies are particularly striking in years 73-74, years 82-84, which correspond to the Sahelian droughts that all of you have in mind. And year 2002 was also an exceptional year. Outside these, I mean, if you put these sub-periods apart, as you can see, average SPEI values are mostly negative over this long period of time, with a few exceptions. And this explains why we will mainly focus on dry events in our analysis. As another illustration, this figure is actually a map of Mali, which shows the distribution of these SPEI index across the territory in May 2009, right? And as you can see, there are substantial variation over the country, right? And we use these variation over time and over the territory to identify the effect of climate on migration pattern. Right, so let me briefly, because time's flying, briefly give you an overview of the main results, right? So what we do basically is we regress local net migration rates during each intercensual period on the frequency, the number of dry years over the same intercensual periods, okay? And so what we find is that drought frequency, the number of droughts definitely have an impact on net migration rates. With significant differences between rural and urban localities, which is quite expected, right? If we have in mind the agricultural channel, right, we expect rural localities to be much more vulnerable to climate events than urban localities. Okay, so what we find is that when a given area is hit by dry episodes, we find that rural localities in these areas experience a decrease in net migration rates, which means that there are more people leaving these localities than people who join these localities, okay? And we do not find such impact in urban localities. If any, the impact we find is the opposite, right? We find that urban localities have more people coming in during dry years than people going out. What we find is, in addition, that this impact is heterogeneous depending on age, and we find that the impact is the strongest for younger men aged 20-29 and then decreases with age. We do not find much difference between men and women in terms of in terms of the impact of climate on mobility. What else? Yeah, so just to briefly summarize this first batch of results, we find that dry events tend to accelerate rural out-migration. And if we use our basic estimates and the number of droughts that were experienced by Mali over the period, okay, if we want to get numbers, okay, we find that over the periods ranging from 1998 and 2009, drought episodes actually translated into an additional net outflow of about 7,000 males and 6,000 female rural migrants per year, right? This gives you an idea of the impact of droughts over the period. With regards international migration, we find that overall drought frequency in the last 5 years increases international migration rates. Okay, but here the magnitude of the effect varies by country or region of destination, which is likely to be due to some cost considerations. Okay, what we find is that in times of hardship resulting from poor climatic conditions, people have a higher average propensity to migrate, but especially so toward short distance neighboring countries, right? And again, if we use our regression results, just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the effects, okay, we estimate that over these periods ranging from 2004 to 2009, drought episodes resulted in about 2,000 additional international moves per year, which is rather small, rather limited. What we do next, and don't worry, I'm nearly finished. We push forward this analysis in order to test for the existence of some heterogeneity of the impacts, and we in particular test whether the effects of droughts differ by agroecological zone, by degree of crop diversification, and by locality wealth. These two accounts for the fact that habitability does not only depend on climate anomalies, but also on other factors. Okay, so what we find is that with regard to the agroecological context, our prior was that in rural localities, more favorable agroecological conditions are likely to be associated with a greater availability of effective or on-farm adaptation strategies and with lower migration in times of drought, while we expect the opposite in less favorable agroecological environments. Okay, and we do find differentiated drought effects with a much stronger magnitude in the arid zone, which is located in the northern part of the country, so much stronger magnitude in this zone and a lesser one in the Sudanese zone, which is in the southern part of the country and which receives much more rainfall on average. Okay, and to echo what François said in his introduction, the size of climate effects on migration in the northern part of the country suggests that in this area, certain thresholds or tipping points may be reached so that people living there may have little choice but left to move when SPI values deviate from their normal values. With regards, we also find that climate effects are much smaller in areas where crops are much more diversified than the area where they are not. And we finally find that climate effects strongly vary by locality wealth. They are stronger for poor localities and progressively diminish for localities of the top quintiles. I may come back to these projected migration outflows if needed, but since my time is over, let me briefly conclude with this. So as a general conclusion, these research suggests that for people in rural areas facing adverse climatic conditions, one of the options is to migrate, and in particular to urban areas, but not exclusively to urban areas. And this stresses the climate urbanization link, which is in line with other papers. We also find some significant climate effects on international moves, whatever the country of destination, but the size of the effect is much smaller than for internal migration. And we do find, some differentiated effects depending on whether the country of destination are far or close to Mali. Okay. So overall, even if the marginal effect we find is probably unlikely to be an underestimation of climate effects on international migration because of measurement issues. I can come back to this with the questions. The pictures we get is much less worrying in terms of intensity, in terms of numbers, than the current narrative suggests. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fleur. And now, are there any questions from the floor for the presentation?
Hi, Fleur. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I just had a clarification question, because you say that the climate effects strongly vary by locality wealth, which is, of course, something that we know very well. I was just wondering, in what aspect? Does it increase mobility? Does it decrease mobility? Or is it just effects normally? Because that would be perhaps interesting to unpack a little bit the way that poverty is accelerated by climate impacts and therefore actually leaves a lot of people immobile. So wondering if you had any insights from Mali.
Yeah. Insight from these research. So what we do is we classify our about 11,000 localities into 5 categories, right? By income quantile, right? We basically compute a wealth index depending on your housing characteristics at the locality level, right? So we then classify the different localities into these different quintile, right? And what we find is that actually the climate effects on migration is the strongest for the poorest localities, right? And actually disappears in localities belonging to the top quintile. Right, so it's on the one hand, it could be, it's not necessarily expected, right? Because we often mention the existence of a poverty constraint, liquidity constraints on mobility, right? It is probably due to the fact that the focus here is on internal migration, which does not cost too much, right? And hence it can be affordable even for people belonging to the I mean, residing in localities from the lowest quintile, right? There is probably some heterogeneity within locality themselves, right? Because obviously there are some inequalities at the locality level as well within locality, but at this level of disaggregation, we are working on at the locality level. Okay, so we cannot consider these within locality inequalities.
Thank you very. Thank you very.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Lorenzo Guadagno with the Platform on Disaster Displacement. I have one question on the presentation and perhaps a couple more that articulate with the general introduction of the project, and I hope that won't be long. But the question on the presentation is relates to the migration as it is observed as a basically one-way event, or whether there is any sort of return migration or circular migration that's observed once the drought subsides, whether it's anything that the study has been able to capture. And it kind of also, to me, triggers a question about what you mean with the project by habitability. Is it kind of a short-term temporary condition, or is it more of an irreversible change? And how do you articulate the fact that you're taking basically slow onset hazards to articulate a discourse on climate change broadly, and the kind of impacts that it could have on irreversible inability of ecosystem ultimately? So I guess there is a part for Flor and perhaps a part for the panel maybe. Thanks.
Right, so I will briefly answer the first part of your question. So as you understand, I mean, given the data I'm using here, that is census data, what I call, I mainly use population increments between two censuses as as my measure of migration, right? I mean, after taking rid of natural population growth, right? So it means that basically what I use is the differences in population growth at a highly disaggregated level. Okay, there are some localities that grow very fastly, some other localities that grow much less fast, and even some localities that lose population, right? And I just look at whether these differentiated growth patterns are related to climate events, right? So so maybe one simple way to answer your question is I mainly consider permanent migration, right? Or migration that is long enough to have an impact on the size of the population at a locality level. I hope this clarifies. François, if you want to answer the second part of the question.
Well, not necessarily, but what I think here is that it is very interesting to see that the results sometimes can differ slightly from the trends that we observe for migration dynamics in general when it comes to migration associated with climate change, and probably for the reason that you indicated, which is most of it on relatively short distances. And I think that perhaps, and this fits within a broader question, to what extent migration associated with climate change is similar or different from migration flows at large. And I think that what you observe here in Mali indicates that because of the internal short distance nature, some of the relationships when it comes to disaggregating these relationships per social class can be different from the relationship that we observe for migration flows at large. And I think this is a very important insight that we can observe through the work that you've conducted.
Yes, so in our set, we so far we're also considering those two apart from each other, so the slow onset and the fast onset events. And for the slow onset events, we can consider like long-term effects taking place by means of considering different SSP scenarios or making like more details on that for when it comes to regional levels. And when it comes to the fast onset events, what we're currently doing is like actually to try to understand the return rates and the regularity of those extreme events and by means of time series analysis, because this is like important for us to get in how far they change and how long are they lasting and what is like the return rate. And once we have like settled this down, we would like to check in how far they affect migration rates. And once we have understood like the interplay between those two, we can consider in the next step how to implement that in our models and for future scenarios. That is like as a technical answer how we would approach that.
Okay, are there any more questions for this presentation? In that case, thank you for the excellent questions. And I will now give the floor to Diana Rekin from the University of Twente. She's an associate professor of climate change and urban inequalities, and she'll be discussing the initial results of fuzzy cognitive mapping in Ghana and Kenya.
Thank you, Claire, for the very nice introduction. Yes, and hi to everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm sharing my screen, right? Is that how we do it? So let's try. You should actually see my screen, but maybe not in presentation mode yet. Do you see it in presentation mode now?
It's perfect, thank you.
Okay, so now we just, I think, it's not the first one though, it's just slide 2. Yeah, okay, thanks. So I'm presenting on what we currently know is part of work package 2, and we are working on perception and migration decision. We're also interested in the causes of migration, so it's very much related to what we've just seen, and it was very interesting, and I think we need to talk more about where our data aligns or not, but this is really on perception. And we investigate the perceptions of environmental and socioeconomic conditions and their influence on migration. We will compare sending and receiving areas, so also hopefully to make up of kind of changes in perception, yeah? When time passes. We compare all primary sites, and we also want to differentiate across gender at a later point. For all of that, we're using fuzzy cognitive mapping, which I will introduce in a bit. So why is perception important? Perception is a subjective social reality. Huh? So the world around us is perceived in our heads as fitting to certain patterns that we know from the past or certain experiences. And often they are actually fitted in pre-experience. It's very difficult to change perception. So actually it only happens over time and is a slow process. And perception can deviate from objective reality quite a bit. As many psychologists have shown, perception is what drives decision-making and action, not necessarily what we would call objective reality. So that's why we are very interested in understanding what people think about why they moved, so what they say the reasons were. So there's, of course, again, a difference between what they perceive and what they express as a perception, but it's still the closest you can get if you asked people. And yes, then we say that understanding the migration decision-making process that's informed by such perception gives us a more nuanced picture of potential nonlinear climate-driven migration patterns and of migration flows. So now, what is fuzzy cognitive mapping? Fuzzy cognitive mapping is that you ask mostly lay people or also experts of a particular field of research what they think the cause-effect relationships are concerning a particular topic. Often you have a leading question in the beginning, like, what do you believe are the causes of migration in your community? And then people are asked to just randomly and very openly and in a very colloquial way name causes, for instance, and these would be called concepts here on the left-hand side. So you can actually have these as variables in your mental model. So then you have here, for instance, 4 ABCD causes. And then in a second stage, you ask the interviewee, so now tell me, how are these related? And here you see the example on the left-hand side that B leads to A, that D leads to A, that D increases B, and that C increases D, whereas B, and these are here in red, shown in red, decreases C. And you also ask for the strength of that relationship. So such a causal weighted model, weighted because we have a strength of weights on the cause-effect relations, can actually be used to get insights on what kind of causes people mention, how strong the interactions are. And also you can use that for modeling, kind of social modeling. If you, for instance, change a particular concept that would, if a certain policy is implemented, be affected by that policy. And then you can compare the outcome of this network simulation without a policy change or with a policy change. So it's also a form of a very simple, I would say, very simple modeling approach. And on the right-hand side, you see parts of the analysis. So at first, such a mental model and cause-effect weighted network is transformed in an adjacency matrix, and then you can perform network statistics and network simulation. Okay, as this is kind of not a very familiar, it's not very new, it exists maybe since 20 years in the environmental sciences, but still not very common to many. We did a pilot training, so as that had to be happen during Corona, we recorded online presentations and really trained our enumerators on how to do these networks with interviewees. Here you see pictures. And then we rolled those out in our 5 primary sites. And you can see those here. So we will, and you also see the status where data is collected, where we started analysis, or where data collection will happen throughout the year. Yeah. So in most countries, the sending area is a very rural, agricultural, focused and dominated area. And then the destination area is usually either a regional hub or the national capital. And we now have data collected in all sending sites and 2 destination sites, but data collection is ongoing. This is a couple of pictures from the field. So just to give you a flavor, it's usually quite an intensive process with one interviewee. So it takes about 30 to 45 minutes, and it also demands a little bit of creative thinking of the interviewer and interviewee to actually express this in a network. But on the advantageous side, so on the flip side, it's also very tangible to people because they can see when the interviewer draws the network and says, you are saying this, increases this. So I'm drawing an error from here to here, and you see it influences this very strongly, yes? And then they can actually understand and see their mental model building up. Yeah. So this is an example from the field, how it can look like. This is a rather large network. Yeah, so usually we would say we are happy with 15 concepts. That's a good number that provides you some depth into the thinking and is not too complex. But sometimes people really like the method, and then they're getting intrigued and they add more aspects. Yeah? So in the end, usually you have a lot of causes and you have a web of causes, but also the interviewee then adds a number of consequences, not only of conditions in the field, but also sometimes of the migration. Yeah. So, but our idea was to capture all the perceived causes of migration. And in the sending side, we were asking people who had household members that had migrated. So that's an additional complication, that we only asked household members, what do you think are the reasons why this person in your household migrated? But we still think it's valid and reasonable because these decisions are made on a household level in these communities, right? Yeah, so here preliminary results from the two sending sites where we have now started to analyze the data. That's Kajiaka in Makueni County in Kenya and Lunbunga in Tolon district in Ghana. What we see as who moves is actually predominantly male in both cases. So on the left-hand side, you see here a split up between the cases. On the left, Kenya, and on the right, Ghana, and then a split between gender, female and male. We only ask for female and male. So these are 70% male in Kenya and about 78% male in Ghana. Overall, then it's like 75% male that migrate. We do have slightly different interview numbers, and that also at some point later in the analysis plays a role, but just for you to give you a flavor here. And then the respondent occupations in Kenya and the above left is that you see really most of them are crop farmers, small business owners, and unpaid home carers. It's a little bit wider, broader, the occupation types than what we see in Ghana. We were in a really rural area, so you see most of the respondents being busy in farming. Yeah? And for us, that also shows that we can only compare both cases to some extent. So we should be careful in making too many generalizations across the sites, because the sample is not completely the same. Yeah, we still need to be mindful of that. And then where do migrants go? So in Kenya, it's very so the large majority goes to Nairobi straight away. And then in Ghana, it's the same. It's actually most of them go to Accra, so to the national capitals. And this is actually when then in the end, how our data can look. We are further processing this, but this is that you put all the individual maps that we've seen as drawn maps, when those are actually merged together, so that the same meaning of a concept is then averaged, and the same connections are averaged, and then you get something what you call a social map. So what the perceived reality of the community is. And we will make these more pretty. So we then have nodes that have a certain color when they are in certain sector or field and aspect, and then we can see better relations, but this is actually our raw data. And the same we have for Ghana. You can already see some insights here that, for instance, household income on the lower left and then decision to move on the lower right are those concepts which are largest, so have the highest ingoing and outgoing arrows or relations. So these are dominant in the maps, yeah? And that are all belong to network statistics. These you can also then later analyze what kind of what the network statistics say. And that comes here. So for instance, the frequency of mentioned concepts in a group, we have each concept that is given by an individual grouped to a certain sector or group cluster thing, like here, economy and finance. So all individual concepts that belong to economy and finance are then put into this group, and then we have employment, agriculture, livestock, climate, family, and so on. We see that in Kenya, most concepts are given that end up in the employment category and in the economy and finance category. Whereas in Kenya, it's really much more only about economy and finance. And then the second one is agriculture, livestock, forestry, and fishing. That relates to the point that we have a lot more farmers in Ghana, and in Kenya, a bit more broader, widespread occupations. And what we want to highlight here is that agriculture, livestock, forestry and fishing, employment, and economy and finance all kind of belong into the category of occupation. So we are concerned about what you do, whether it generates enough money and whether you can sustain your livelihoods from that. So it's maybe the very broad category of livelihood. And right after that already comes climate, yeah? And only then family. So, and here, what is actually grouped under climate? This is when people mention drought, amount of rainfall, floods, climate change impacts, dry season, or deforestation, or any other concepts that kind of are a synonym of that. And here you see in Ghana, the orange is a lot more concepts mentioned in relation to drought, but also flood, climate change, dry season, and deforestation. And in Kenya, it's mainly drought and amount of rainfall. So the very preliminary policy implications, because we are doing much more analysis. So we still need to do the scenario analysis. We need to analyze the relations and a lot more network statistics, but the very preliminary policy implications are that mostly young males migrate, that individuals don't necessarily report climate change as a main driver in migration decision making. It's just a part of a causal cascade, but economic and employment concepts that are related to climate remain the main factors and influence the migration decisions, at least in those two cases that we have currently analyzed. And migration is heavily focused towards capital cities and remains almost completely within national boundaries. So in our cases, we have not had large accounts of international migration. What we found surprising is that climate-related concepts exhibit stronger influence than family, and that's kind of inconsistent or new as compared to previous research. So in particular in Kenya, climate is a more prominent role than family-related migration decisions. And in the next couple of months, we are then also exploring gender and intersectional differences, different conceptual hierarchies across communities, different understandings of climate-related concepts in different locations. And we do a comparative analysis of perception versus objective climate indicators. And that's also very interesting. And then probably we get in contact also to Floor. So it's very nice that we have all of this here together. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diana. Now, are there any questions for, Are there any questions for Diana? And joining her in responding to these questions will be her colleague, Rachel Keaton.
Yes.
Yes, we have a question here.
Hi, Diana. This is Mary from CARE. I don't know if you can see me. Thank you very much for the very, very nice, very interesting presentation. It's always quite fascinating to hear more about this methodology. I was just curious to hear a little bit more about the concept of decision to move that you have into there, because I can't really understand how it can be on the same page as all of the other concepts that I really understand as factors that can influence migration, but is a decision to move the final consequence of these other concepts of climate impacts and economic situation, etc. So how I don't know if my question is clear, but I don't quite grasp how you can have decision to move as one of the causes that has been identified in the mapping.
Okay, yeah. So it's just as the final consequence of all the causes. So it's not only when, for instance, so as an example, we ask, what are all the different concepts, all the different causes that you have, that you know have contributed to your household decision to let this person migrate. And then they say, oh, there were droughts 3 years in a row before, and also then my husband lost his job, and then our daughter grew older and we needed money for education. So these would be 3 different concepts that we note down, and then we make arrows all to the decision to migrate. And then, for instance, they say, and because of, oh, actually, this is too straightforward. It was not just that my husband lost his job, but that we also lost the income because he didn't find an alternative job. And for instance, this could then later, when people are very engaged in the exercise, they might realize that when someone migrated, so there was the decision to migrate, and then they said our son migrated, that then there is a feedback loop to, for instance, household income. So they understand more that this is all kind of a system, and that the migration, that the decision to move had, of course, some consequences back on what they told us before. The decision to move itself is a consequence in our networks. So it's just when the interviewee is so engaged that he or she sees that has a feedback on how they think about the concept that they mentioned as causes before, then we also, of course, document that feedback loop, for instance. And then, of course, it's a cause, again, for an increase potentially in household income. That can happen. So you can have that then as a feedback loop. It's actually for the modeling and scenario exercise that we want to do with these mental models or weighted networks. It's better if you have feedback loops. Otherwise, it's just straightforward, and you can just do a feed forward calculation. But it's better if you have these feedback loops. That's why it can be. And I also found it very interesting, the question of someone before in the audience about what migration actually means. We were struggling so much with that question in the beginning of the project, right? Because there's so many forms of moving and migration, and we've also seen, at least in the pilot in Ghana where that I was part of, so I went with our Ghana team to the field, that we heard about people that came back, not at the extent of people that migrate to the cities and out of the villages, but it happened, and they had the feeling they needed to tell us. So kind of they were proud of people who came back with more knowledge, with more money, and often they did something nice, then something good to the community. So they brought something, a lot of social capital with them. Yeah, so here we asked people whether they had a household member that migrated for more than 6 months, independently of whether that person later returned or not. So it can actually happen that some of them return to the communities afterwards. But we said that when they were gone for more than 6 months, then we count it as migration. And then, of course, what Floor documented, that is even, maybe even more solid a migration decision, because when it's actually recorded in the census, then it would mean that people registered at the National Statistical or Regional Statistical Office, right? Or otherwise a census would not find them. At least that's what I believe. Yeah. So ours is a bit more in flux, actually. We only say, do you have a member of the household that actually moved away over the last 10 years for more than 6 months? And do you still remember the causes why that happened? So then could you please get in a discussion with us? Would you like to tell us about it and talk with us about it?
Hi, thanks very much. We did a little bit of work with a very different methodology, so it's been really interesting to hear about that, but similar thing about perceptions and decision making. And I was really interested, I've got 2 questions. One about sampling, so where you chose to do your sample and interviews and how you determined that. I'm really curious about, was it places affected by climate change? And particularly, and another question about the role of family and how you understand causes and drivers and where do you put things like facilitators? You know, the context that I had family members here and it might not have been my reason for moving, but it helped me to make that decision. Does that fit into the mapping? Thanks.
Yes. So first about sampling. The sending locations were decided with the country teams, being areas that were in the last 10 years frequently hit by climate impacts, climate extreme events, most often drought. So these were mainly suggested by the country teams, and then with us checked against a number of impact indicators, and then decided upon, let's target that region. And then the country teams decided on locations, on specific communities. That is also in conjunction with Work Package 1, who does the longitudinal survey. So they had actually picked all sites for interviews at a certain point, and then we decided on particular communities within their sample to be comparative at a later stage. But the main reason was that in the last 10 years, there was a climate impact and drought-related impacts. And then our interviewer and went to the communities, said hello to the chief and to often to both, so to the village head and to the chief, and we were asked for permission to go from household to household, and then we did that and asked whether anyone in the household would be able to talk to us if they had a person in the household that migrated for more than 6 months. So that was the single criteria for talking to them. That about the sampling, and then the second question about other drivers of migration, and that is a very good point. We have that in our maps, so people were talking about that. For us, it's a little bit methodological challenge right now to single out those from other causes. So people mention those, and now for us, we need to decide how we report them. Do we just sort them into these groups that we have shown, like climate, employment, finance, and stuff? Or do we actually also group climate as causes and opportunity related aspects as drivers, for instance? Yeah, but we had that pretty often, to be honest, that they said, oh, I had an uncle in town, or I had an aunt in town, I could preliminarily live there, so that was an opportunity for me. That's part of the network. Yeah. And if interested, we could, as I said, we could distinguish between those and then analyze the networks according to these criteria, but we are currently deciding on how to do that. If you're interested, we could. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you to our audience for these wonderful questions. We are now going to go ahead with our following presentation with Harold Sterli, a senior scientist at the Department of Geography and Regional Research at the University of Vienna. He will be discussing as well initial results for focus group discussions on migration impacts.
Hello, thanks a lot. It's great to be here. I'm sorry I was a bit late in the meeting, but I hope I can make it up a bit. Yeah, let me just share my screen. I will give you a brief, hopefully a brief input. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Ah, perfect. Yeah, a brief intro in the work of our work package. Just to give you a very short background, I won't go through all these, but because you might have seen that already a number of times. What Work Package 5 is doing is looking for the effects or the outcomes or the impacts of migration. And we do this with three different perspectives. On the one hand, we look at impacts on different scales, on the individual and the household scales, on various micro level, as Francois already said, but we also want to look beyond that and take into account effects on community and in a limited way also on a regional level, but mostly household, individual, community level. We are having a dedicated intersectional lens here and differentiate the methods and the data, of course, then by various dimensions that make a difference for social status in the respective sites and communities. And we are looking for, when we are talking about the adaptive outcome of migration, on direct impacts or outcomes, like what people can do with effects of migration, and more on the root causes of vulnerability or adaptive capacity level, like the structural conditions and context that enable people to do something or make them vulnerable, and how migration affects these. We are working with a comparative methodology here, trying to get a bit deeper understanding of the complex relations between mechanisms, so how these migration outcomes come into being and the context under which these mechanisms come into play. Yeah, the data collection methods that we are employing are focus group discussions or more a type of PRA tool that uses various moderation facilitation techniques to map and document a range of aspects regarding the livelihoods and livelihood changes, climate risks, adaptation, adaptive capacity and outcomes, but also migration properties of the sites, differences along these different socioeconomic and social groups, and the migration impacts. So I will give you a very brief introduction. We have the data from 2 of the countries, that means from 5 sites, and are currently processing and cleaning up the data and making them fit for the analysis. What is, and I give you now like an overall a wrap up, and I would strongly agree what Diane said, like these sites are different and the things are looking different. I try to give you a brief overview of things that are common, that we find in our first going through the data are quite pervasive to all the sites. So the first thing is, yeah, we have environmental and climatic changes everywhere, and they are mentioned as key influencing factors for community and household well-being. The most important ones, and this is through all these 5 sites, a noticeable decline in soil fertility and an increase of climate extremes, mostly drought, but also flood events. And in 3 of these 5 sites, also deforestation as having a strong impact. But these environmental changes are not the only factors influencing well-being in the communities. What was mentioned in all the communities is the socioeconomic situation at large, inflation and increasing prices, increasing living costs, and the contrast with a lack of local employment opportunities, a changing perspective on youth, independent of migration, on agriculture and rural livelihoods for their own future making, and a strong impact, mostly economic impact of COVID that still is lasting throughout the regions and affecting community well-being and the well-being of people. Regarding migration, well, migration is to a bit varying extent, but in all the 5 sites, a well-established livelihood strategy for a number of 2-3 decades in most sites, predominantly domestic migration, few and very, very little only international migration. On the regional level, like the local and neighboring provinces, for example, to the provincial capitals, more seasonal short-term migration, and on the national level to the capital cities, for example, on the coastal areas in Kenya and in Ghana, also long-term migration. And that means then a couple of years. Some people stay permanently, but mostly the differences here between seasonal migration and a number of years. So the migration impacts that people mention are mixed. There are both negative and positive impacts mentioned, but in all sides, very clearly, the positive impacts are perceived to outweigh the negative impacts. Just to give you a number of examples, classical positive impacts, spatial and sectoral diversification of livelihoods, reducing the risks of agricultural failure due to drought or floods or other events. General increase of income through remittances inflow of living standards. What people are doing is improving their homes, refactoring houses, building stronger houses, putting houses higher, protecting them against floods, and so on and so forth. Increasing food security, increasing the ability to buy food from out of their own production, to change from subsistence farming to market-based farming. Business development, both through financial remittances, enabling people to set up small shops and car repair shops, or beauty salons that was appearing in a number of situations where women came back from capital cities and had worked in these businesses there and brought that back. So through financial remittances, setting up shops, but also the skills transfers necessary, coming back with returning migrants to do these things. And that was also referred to in 3 out of these 5 as increasing the overall economic situation or improving the overall economic situation in communities. Then education, a very important impact. Remittances are invested in the education of children, as either children and also grown-ups perceive the children not having a good future in the places and in agriculture, and wanting children to have better chances in future. And this is, or education is perceived as the main means to do so. But also healthcare financing, that was also mentioned a number of times. Well, there are also negative impacts. One prominent factor is the lack of agricultural labor. And that is a bit, we need to go deeper into this, and how far this is contradicting with the statements that the agricultural situation is generally, or economic situation is generally improving. Social separation of migrants and their household members at the places of origin, relationship breakups in a number of cases, exploitation and bonded labor, also hazardous conditions and deaths of migrants were reported, and a general moral decline, or I would put it probably more neutral, a change in values, especially when young people return. Things were mentioned like young people don't respect the old traditions or the elder people and so on. So basically in a stronger social and cultural way, except with the exploitation and the situation of migrants. In general, the livelihood situation of migrants was stated as declining. So the origin situation, places, or the situation in places of origin was mostly perceiving as improving through migration, and you could say on the back of the migrants in places of destination. Then there were a number of impacts directly related to agriculture and adaptation. I just put them out here separately. Notably, that was mentioned everywhere, introduction of new and especially also drought-resistant crop varieties, contributing to increased resilience or less vulnerability towards climate impacts or climate events in agriculture. New and improved land management practices, for example, contour ridges, erosion prevention to increase or maintain soil fertility, and new water management practices. In a number of cases, migrants were reported to bring back both the knowledge as well as the finances to start irrigation agriculture, or, for example, to build small dams to retain water for the dry season. Both in Kenya and Ghana, this sentence was in a bit varied forms appearing. Migration helps to offset the negative effects or impacts of climate change. What makes then migration work or be in the end on the more positive or negative sides? If we asked for migration success, then we would define that in the multi-scale and multi-place, or the place-wise and scale-wise differentiated perspective of the well-being of migrants as individuals or migrants' households in the places of destination and individuals and households and places of origin. Key factors that appear now, this needs further analysis, but that appears already. One important factor at places of destination is the wealth level or the status, social economic status and resource endowment of households at the places of origin. If households are very poor, they need a lot of support. They are not able to productively invest remittances or to bring new knowledge, skills, and awareness of necessary changes into action. On the other side, once households have sufficient man and woman power at the origin, but also skills and resources available, land, access to water, etc., the chances are much higher that if that remittances, both social and financial, can be turned into adaptive outcomes. A destination crucial part is the working and housing conditions of migrants as origin, and that's fair payment, that's good payment, but also regular payment. These are working conditions, these are rights of migrants. I already mentioned that there were a number of cases mentioned where migrants got hurt or even killed at places of destination, or kept against their will, passes were being kept, etc. If it's there were some examples of international migration. The social networks and embedding of migrants in the destination areas. So it's not a new finding. It's quite in line with what we know already from other studies. But once migrants have a better embedding, social and economic embedding in places of destination, chances are much higher that migration turns out as a kind of success. And that is linked also with the educational level of migrants. One of the factors is the stability of the relations between migrants and households or family members of origin. Once these relations get cut or unstable or weakened, chances are high that migrants are lacking in the places of origin and not remitting or sending anything to support the household, and that can again then of course be detrimental for both sides. Yeah, maybe as a first part to conclude, as I just said, these are very, very first level interim findings, needing much more in-depth analysis. But what already comes out from that, what would be messages for policy and practice? I think we can be quite sure that what we can see, or what we see as an appearing picture, is that in situ adaptation, improved or more support for in situ adaptation and local employment opportunities would be highly beneficial for this migration / livelihood / vulnerability / adaptation context, because they would increase the choice of migration. I didn't mention that. It's the one factor that comes also in here is the mode of migration. The more planned and the more strategic migration is happening, the higher the likelihood of migration success. The more unplanned or in short decision-making temporal scopes migration happens, the less chances or the higher are chances for situations of exploitation of migrants or of general unsuccessful, in parentheses, migration. So training and preparation of migration, that was mentioned a number of times also in the focus groups, that would be beneficial for migrants, specific skills depending on the location then, but also helping people to find the right place to go to, so the decision-making, supporting the decision-making process, but also for improving or counseling on how to prevent relationship breakups, or let's say how to maintain social relations in a healthy state. Financial training of household members was mentioned a number of times, technical training as well to implement changes and improvements in livelihoods, and especially in agricultural innovation and adaptation, to better make use of resources that can be provided through migration. And of course, the protection of migrants against exploitation and bonded labor in places of destination. So what's next for us, and it's my final slide, with the next data coming in, what will happen is that we are started that now, but that needs improvement, and that needs a reassessment and an improvement of the coding strategy. Site-wise coding and analysis, and establish a code system that functions per site to establish profiles of each research site that can be then used also by the other work packages as contextualization, or for contextualization as a background information. And the next step then, development of a cross-site functioning coding and analysis system to enable a comparison of the migration outcomes on site level, and to provide context information. That's then for the last step, to combine this contextualization of migration outcomes and impacts with the household interview data of work package 4 from the Potsdam Institute, and to run a comparative analysis of migration outcomes in the different contexts and situations under which they come into play, and the mechanisms, how these outcomes are achieved, and the contexts under which these mechanisms come into play. So thanks a lot. Ich kann es nicht.
Thank you very much, Harold. And we have a question here in the front.
Kann jetzt nicht.
Hi, Harold. Thank you. Thank you very much for this great presentation. It's very interesting to see the findings coming out. And I guess perhaps one thing that I was thinking of the major findings, which is that the majority of people perceive migration to be a positive. And I wonder here if there is, a role of perception in the sense that most of the sites that we are choosing for habitable are origin regions, not destination regions. And when you're asking about migration to people that return, there is often this social pressure, expectation to paint a picture of your migration journey as a success. Whereas when you interview these people at destination, that's where you're going to get the more crude reality of exploitation, of et cetera, et cetera. So I wonder if this is something that we are thinking about in terms of perception, social representation of the narrative that people want to paint of migration because of the social expectations that are attached to it.
Yeah, thanks. That's of course an important point. Yeah, absolutely. As I said, this is I would say it's not the community level. I would say it's probably not the meso level, but for our project, I think we can refer to this as a kind of meso level in between the more regional or social ecological system scale and the individual household scale. So yes, absolutely. We have these biases in here. What I probably didn't mention is that in the methodology, we assess these different migration outcomes, of course, separately, like asking for different aspects, positive and negative, and just listed them. And then there was a general reflection round upon these visualized results of positive and negative impacts just for that tool, for example. And that was where the question came up, okay, what is probably more salient here as an impact? And that depends highly, of course, on the selection of individuals sitting in this group. That depends on the context of this setting and the social situation. That's where expectations come in. And that's the reason why I think what really will be the much added value in this inter-method comparison than to combine these with the household interviews in origin sites and in destination sites to contextualize and also triangulate both or to complement, let's say, both types of knowledges that we produce here.
Thank you very much, Harold. Thank you, Sarah. Do we have any other questions for Harold? If not, given that we're running a bit behind schedule, we wanted to respect the moment for coffee break. So we're going to go ahead with that for now, and then we'll continue afterwards with our colleague Gianfranco.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Harold.
So if I speak like that and you change it, and just so you know, you have to hear here a bit louder than you would like, otherwise at the back they don't hear it. And Claire speaks very close to the mic. Hello, my name is Oliviane. I'm working with Eric. Toot, toot, toot. You have to turn it a lot. Go ahead. Yeah, it works and it's better. Yeah. And people on Zoom, you have to turn it way, way up. And then Claire always speaks very closely. So.
Let's do it. Hello, everyone. We're going to continue. If you could please take your seats again. Thank you very much. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for coming back. We hope you enjoyed your break. Now, we're going to continue with the previously scheduled presentation. And this is actually a perfect thing to transition with, a perfect dynamic, because we're now taking maybe a bit step back and going into the transition to policy options and seeing overall themes for the project. In addition, in order to respect the time constraints that we do have, we're going to reorganize a bit the way that we're doing the questions. Namely, we're going to have all of the presentations go, and then we'll have a moment for joint questions at the end for everyone, which again will also work well because the presentations and the speakers really have concepts that overlap with each other. So without further ado, Gianfranco Nucera, a research fellow at Sapienza University of Rome, will present on identifying policy options on climate migration.
Thank you very much, Claire, and good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here in the International Environment House to discuss about the process and methodology to identify policy option on this complex issue as the relationship between climate change and migration. In my presentation, I will not enter into details about the policy option because, of course, we discuss more in the details tomorrow on the policy session, but I will give an outlook on the process we use to identify these options and to develop the policy brief that Sergio mentioned in the introduction. To this end, I decided to divide my presentation into these 5 parts to give you some inputs on the maybe some concluding remarks also on this kind of option. So to start with the context, the first phase of our works relates, of course, to the origins of the Habitable project, because it is something, as Francois said, very innovative because of the systemic approach it adopts concerning the climate migration nexus. And the general objectives of the project should be related to the fact that climate change represents an increasing driver, of course, there are many kind of research, qualitative, quantitative, to explore this kind of link, but it is out of doubts that according to some reports, there is an increasing number of people moving due to climate change. So in this framework, our objective is to deliver realistic and ambitious recommendations to inform policies and legal instruments. So this kind of option should respond, I should say, in a dynamic way to this kind of this situation, considering also possible scenarios that describe a consistent increase in the number of climate migrants because of the tipping points. So there is something that we should not predict very precisely. So when we are before in the slide, in the second slide, when we start to design the conceptual framework, the first phase regarded the integration of key concepts into our research framework, particularly habitability and social tipping points. And we know that habitability, as Sergio mentioned, has been recalled several times in judicial decisions, and with the idea that there is something that create action obligation for the state to adopt preventive or protection measures. And the social tipping points, in our perspective, legal and policy perspective, is clearly related to the uninhabitability, because it's like it reflects the consequent collective decision to move. In this sense, it introduces a temporal perspective in our analysis, because there are some options that works well before the tipping point is reached, and some policies that works better after the tipping point is reached. So this division is not, of course, a clear division, is very blurred, but it helps us to categorize this kind of options and to create a sort of list, a set of options along a continuum built around the concept of habitability and social tipping points. But this conceptual framework should also be integrated with a human rights-based approach. So the idea is that these options should promote and protect human rights in every phase of the intervention concerning climate migration. And in this sense, also the relationship between human rights and climate change has been explored by international organizations, by the academic literature, particularly in the case of international organization, of course, UN bodies. Before Sergio mentioned the Human Rights Council, but I want to mention also the General Assembly and the resolution adopted in 2022 on the human rights, the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which affirmed that climate change interferes with effectively exercise of all fundamental rights, and also the preamble of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which recall a series of human rights that states should consider when adopting mitigation and adaptation measures. In order to verify how human rights are promoted and protected, we decide to use case law, so judicial decision, because strategic litigation is something that is very helpful to test this kind of option. So we can understand how the states apply mitigation adaptation measure and in a complementary way protect human rights, because there are very much example of this kind of judicial decision. There are reports that confirm over 2,000 judicial cases, most of them adopting a human rights-based approach. So this is something that we have considered very, very carefully. And in this sense, with this general framework, we identify 5 areas of interest: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, human mobility, and climate displacement. After that, we try to identify some criteria for the identification of policy option. And there is no generally agreed method for the identification of policy option, but there are specific characteristics for testing whether a proposed measure could be effective. In this sense, a proposed policy option should be clear, practical, and proven, meaning that both the application and the efficacy have been demonstrated or argued. So also something that should be demonstrated in the future. Secondly, the proposed option should be objectively verifiable. And thirdly, such measures should significantly address climate migration patterns and human rights of persons involved. So something that describes like general or specific criteria to identify policy option. This option could be implemented unilaterally, bilaterally, or multilaterally, and we prefer the last option because those criteria, those measures developed in a multilateral framework would have the best chance of being generally adopted and then implemented. So we identified this kind of options: clear, implementable, verifiable, and then we try to understand the applicability of this measure. So it is important to identify who will be involved, the respective roles and responsibility of different actors, what is necessary to plan and implement the measure, try to explain the rationale of the measure, at what point actors should develop the action to maximize its benefits, and then to describe how to implement a specific measure in terms both of action and verification. So it's something that we should also take into account for future steps in the research. Given this broad picture, our research activities in order to have the policy brief was based on different steps. First of all, data collection. We collected a series of reports, academic articles, papers, and so on, over 700 documents. And of course, we have to select the most relevant on of these documents in order to decide which would have been the best option for the climate migration, for addressing climate migration nexus. And in this sense, we decide to have a workshop to discuss relevant practices. The workshop we held during the annual meeting in Rome to discuss the main element of these policies. It was organized by Sapienza, Adelphi, also NCS-IR, like also in a multi-level way. We discuss international policies, national and also subnational policies. After that, there was the idea to introduce to more inputs, you remember Francois from Global South. So we decided to have also a call for input to integrate different stances into the research. And this this call for inputs produce interesting results, because we have a lot of responses from also colleagues from primary sites, international organizations, NGOs. So something that helps us to systematize and systematize the works. Lastly, but also very important, we benefit from cross-fertilization of the research conducted under other VPs, not primary site, because we are now disseminating the first findings of primary site, but from output produced on specific concepts. For example, the conceptual model of social tipping points, the conceptual model on climate change and human mobility interaction, the gender and social equity note from Sarah, the stakeholder engagement strategy. So all these kind of documents helped us to introduce this kind of perspective coming from other VPs. So, in conclusion, we identified a set of 30 policy options. Of course, it's not this is not a complete overview. There are hundreds of policy options. We decide to select those that are more, I should say, relevant, for example, for this phase of the research. So there are something more general, other more specific, but there is like a comprehensive picture of the possibility the states have to respond to a phenomenon like that of climate migration. And of course, this policy brief is a living document. So we need also to update, to integrate with these results from primary sites. And we understood that these policy options should cover all the cycle of the relationship between climate change and migration, supporting habitability and responding to uninhabitability. So it is something that we should take into account to cover all these 5 areas of interest, not only a specific kind of response. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to concretely respond to this kind of situation that we talked at the beginning. So it's very difficult for all the states to, for example, respond to 200 million of people moving. So we should try to be more proactive in the policy response and also take into account the protection measures, which should be, of course, something to use when there is no choice and the uninhabitability is confirmed. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gianfranco. As I said before, we're going to hold for the questions for now and then wait until the end, and then we'll have a joint session for questions. We are also rotating or switching 2 of our presentations around. We'll have the same contributors, but now we are going to hear from our colleague Dennis Tensler, who is the Director Head of Program Climate Policy at Adelphi. And he will be continuing the conversation of taking things to a more macro level, going into good practices in addressing climate-related human mobility.
Yeah, thank you very much. And greetings from Berlin, and thanks for having me and us here as part of this very exciting technical session with very, very interesting insights. And I hope to complement in the coming minutes a little bit was already outlined before by Gianfranco on the overall context of policy options, moving a little bit to what we may refer to as good practices for developing evidence-based policies in the future. With that, I represent a little bit the work of our group at Adelphi working on this topic: Emily Ryder-Kelly, Adrian Detges, Tobias Bernstein, and Beatrice Morcello. And try to give you a little bit of an overview where's our starting point. When we are discussing as part of our work in supporting what the University of Roma has been developing, and also what we try to develop as part of the working package 6.2, but also as our a part of our scenario narrative developing work in working package 7. What is our overall normative approach to the different policy challenges? That is basically influenced by 4 elements as outlined here as an introduction, that we see that climate change impacts are intensifying and acting in combination with other risk factors to increase migration and displacement in many places. So we need to act quickly and effectively, and also we need to act today to address the challenges of tomorrow. Migration and displacement have multiple drivers. I think that has been mentioned today again and again. So we see when we are talking about a good policy collection, we need to go for a toolbox approach of integrated responses in order to find appropriate responses. Affected and vulnerable groups need protection first and foremost. So there's a need for an intersectional, rights-based, participative approach. And I think that was also mentioned today very importantly again and again. And more policies are referring to climate-related human mobility. That is also something that we found as part of our work here in Habitable, but also in complementing work. So there's also the need for robust, coherent policies and sufficient resources and capacities for implementation. So in the project, our focus so far have been on basically 2 parts. The one what I already mentioned in the working package 7 is that we dedicated this work to the development of scenario narratives. This is focusing on the one hand and on slow onset events, and on the other hand on rapid onset events. There we aim at co-producing insights for future actions to what also was mentioned today, to inform most ideally also adaptation policies. And we want to contextualize the conceptual ideas that we have with case study insights. So also get the insights from the representative from the case study regions and countries mentioned before. In our work on the policy option working package, we contributed to the long list. We searched for guidance on good practices. I will elaborate a little bit on this in a minute, and then see how, of course, we will be able in the following months to apply them to existing policy frameworks, also identifying of policy objectives as well as good practices for the planning, but also for the implementation process. So this is a little bit still work in progress, especially when we come to the development of scenario narratives. We are really excited and looking forward to our second round of scenario workshop happening next week with some of you also presenting today in Berlin, and also then the third round where we try to combine the work of the different working packages 6 and 7, and to also bring this to a good practice paper at in the fall of this year. Very briefly, in order to also give a little bit of room for our overall discussion, our starting point from a political science perspective is pretty much to argue with the policy cycle as a model. Of course, we adjust this as appropriate in order to, but really to highlight that there are different stages where we may be able to identify good practices, and that will be important also to hopefully give valuable input to policymakers. So starting with the overall assessment, moving to a goal and policy formulation where we have a strong focus on, move over to the design and planning of actionable activities and concrete measures, moving to implementation then, and then also to close the policy cycle, to have an ongoing monitoring and evaluation. I will leave this part out of the presentation today, but we also see that this is very important in order to complete the cycle and have an ongoing learning process. And I think it's clear to say that this is pretty much not, we try to define it as stages, but in reality, of course, they are overlapping and mutual reinforcing. For the assessment part, we also looking at different sources of from UNFCCC to PDD and other sources in this context of climate change and human mobility. The assessments pretty much need to, in our understanding, also to be referred to the local context as a key. I think that was also is one major takeaway of this or approach of the habitable project. Climate change impacts, of course, vary in the respective locations and contexts. We have different environmental, but also social, economic, and political aspects, and they do interplay with this human mobility and other factors. So we see that there's an ongoing move to come up with national and subnational assessments on climate-related human mobilities. International organizations as well as research projects are working on that. IOM assessing the evidence is one example here. Also the Transre project. We have the weathering risk project, and also some of the work the African Climate Mobility Initiative is delivering, and of course also the PDD, and with this is really important work in this area. So what we can see here is a characteristic that they normally use mixed methods. These are interdisciplinary approaches. Involvement of affected groups is a key, and also then to try to bring together overviews of existing knowledge, policies and strategies, and governance arrangements. As a prerequisite, we may refer to sufficient data, capacity, and funding as pretty obvious, but in the concrete case, this is again and again of relevance, as we can see here. When it comes to second dimension, the goal and policy formulation, what we take from the literature is that policies need to address climate-related human mobility. Policies addressing climate-related human mobility should increase the agency of migrants by reducing risks and increasing their adaptive capacities. And most ideally should be aligned, and so there we go to the multi-level perspective here, be aligned with relevant international frameworks, be it the Paris Agreement, where we have a more and more intensive discussion of climate change and human mobility, the SDGs, also other conventions like the UNCCD, and operationalize these top-line goals according to the local context, what we can identify there as a demand. One potential example that we see that is driving into this direction is the Kampala Ministerial Declaration on Migration, Environment and Climate Change, in order to this declaration with the overall aim to bring nations across the Eastern Horn of Africa region together to prioritize, respond to, and galvanize global support to deal with the harsh impact of climate change in the respective regions. Over here we have explicitly the international perspective to give one concrete example. Moving to this phase of design and planning, here we see as of utmost importance that there's the need to create a sound basis for the implementation, also the monitoring of activities, while of course the content, the substance of the policy is important, but we see what we can see again and again, how important the overall planning process also beyond the local level is that brings together and generates buy-in among the different stakeholders affected across government and society. This is a key. One example we try to go deeper into is Vanuatu national policy on climate change and disaster-induced displacements, where we see at least some of the characteristics of concrete actionable steps and commitments across those different areas. Also supportive governance arrangements and signals of inclusive intersectional approaches with also the involvement of local governments and society. So we try to highlight this here as part of this design and policy context, that in order to see to what extent these policies can be responsive to the context and also ambitious overall within what is feasible. The fourth and last dimension for today, the implementation. There obviously we can approach this from quite different angles. We see that there are many factors, and one we also dedicate quite some attention to is including the availability of sufficient funding and finance. So we have examples from the People's Survivals Fund in the Philippines, in more broadly trying to strengthen the adaptive capacities of the frontline local governments, for already active for quite some time. We see in the area of innovative finding solutions, where we have an overall collection of different elements. For example, forecast-based finance as one approach, with an example from Mongolia, where the enablement of disbursement of livestock nutrition kits and unconditional cash transfers for the most affected groups is at the heart of the policy, or other elements of the that are in focus of the what is outlined in the anticipation hub 1 year ago, be it in Senegal, be it in Bangladesh. To close with a kind of a deep dive to indicate how this can, at the implementation level, can come together in an overall approach. There's this example from Fiji with the relocation guidelines and relocation trust fund, in order to guide and enabling relocation as a basically as an pretty new example, but also only coming into play as a measure of last resort. But I think what we can see there as an example is how important it is to set out principles and social safeguards to guide the government, but also in their interaction with the affected communities, those communities at risk from increasing sea level rise in the Iceland's coastal areas. So there's a close interaction with affected villages and communities, which as a key priority for participatory processes. And this has also involved community consultations and setting up of cross-sectoral government relocation task force. And this is also combined with an with the relocation, the climate relocation of communities trust fund as one example. This is of course very recent, but as one to highlight how integrated responses may be designed on the ground and really trying to build the bridge between the different levels. I will close with that, looking at the overall time, and happy to dive deeper into a discussion with you later.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for your excellent presentation. We are now going to continue with Sarah Vigil, Research Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and she will be taking the discussion to intersectionality, going into human rights and migration in a changing climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for everyone for staying this long. I hate to be the person between the cocktail and the end of the day, but let's try and make it short and sweet. So really, it is a great pleasure to be with you today, and the aim of this presentation is to dive a little bit deeper into this aspect that has kept coming up today about intersectionality, about gender, about social inequity. To a certain extent, I'm sure that most of you are quite familiar with these concepts, and these concepts are absolutely vital for the Habitable project, because the Habitable project seeks to steer away from environmentally deterministic explanations and to really focus on the social and political connections in the migration and climate change nexus. So if we're looking at the gendered dimensions of migration, so first of all, and this is something that is good to note, we know that gender shapes environmental impacts and the entire migration process through relations that are determined by other identities, such as class, such as race, age, and ability, meaning gender does not act independently from other key markers of social difference. The distribution of all types of resources and of migration opportunities is in fact power-driven, and it's shaped by these social identities and by people's position in society. So it is about much more than the flood, than the hazard, than the storm. It's about the inequality, the marginalization that the storms and the floods find in place when they come. And these relations are, of course, temporally and spatially contextual. So we cannot talk, it's not the same gendered and social equities in the global north as in the global south, between countries, within communities, etc. And this is why it's interesting in a project like Habitable that we are indeed moving towards projects that are comparative and where we are comparing not only places where there are diverse climate impacts, but places where there are very diverse social situations of discrimination, of marginalization, etc. Because we believe that these are essential explanatory factors of the climate and migration nexus. And lastly, it's also important to note that climate development and migration policies themselves are also accentuating gender and social inequities, unfortunately. So it is not just the biophysical impacts of climate change that can accentuate inequalities, but unfortunately many of the policies enacted in the name of mitigation, in the name of adaptation, in the name of protection, when they do not take really a human rights-based approach, they can make the situation a lot worse than it was. So this is why we really focus on this, not only because of the explanatory power of intersectionality, but because without considering these issues, we can potentially propose solutions that will make the situation a lot worse. Next slide, please. So mutually transforming relations. And you will have heard this concept, so social tipping points. So these gender and social relations are key in shaping these social tipping points, as well as the perceptions of socio-environmental risks. And this is, of course, quite obvious. It is not the same to be a farmer in Ghana than to be an office worker in an air-conned office in Bangkok. The temperature might be very similar. The shock, the heat stress might be very similar, but your perception of risk is going to be absolutely different. So therefore, we cannot make any extrapolations from a climate impact to a perception or to an action without understanding the livelihoods, the identities, the positions of people that are living these shocks. And also they are mutually transforming these relations because of course, on the one hand, gender and social relations influence who moves and why, and also how decisions about migration are made within households across countries, based on cultural expectations, social pressures, etc. And on the other hand, migration can actually change these pre-existing socio-ecological inequities, either by entrenching traditional values and norms or by challenging and transforming them. So what does this mean? That sometimes migration actually creates deeper divides between communities. There's social stigma. For example, when women migrate to urban centers, they might be frowned upon. What is it that you're doing? You know, what kind of practices are you doing in the city? Or it might be that migration actually allows people to come into contact with other types of social relations and dynamics that progressively change the origin communities as well. Next slide, please. However, and although a lot of this now said, it might sound a bit obvious. Unfortunately, a lot of the work that has been done on gender, climate, and migration is still has these kind of limitations. And first of all, there's this kind of binaries, looking at binaries, so men versus women, as if gender was something that was really about women, or skilled versus unskilled, or forced versus voluntary. So trying to put people in boxes when actually the reality is a lot more complex than that. When gendered considerations are included, these are often flattened to statistical categories to disaggregate migration patterns. So it's useful because, of course, we need statistics and we need data because they allow us to, they tell us who is vulnerable. So who is moving? It tells us who is vulnerable and who is moving, but it doesn't tell us why. So we accumulate a lot of data, but perhaps we're lagging a bit behind on the analysis. So 50% of women, 50% of men. And what does this mean? Why? So what? In these arguments, women are often presented either as victims or as champions. So there is, this narrative, women are the front victims of climate impacts, and then there's the opposite argument, which is they are the champions. And this is in a way essentializing a simplification, but it can also actually add more burdens onto women, as if on top of all the other responsibilities they had, they now must add saving the planet to their list. So therefore, there's some kind of scant attention to how social relations and multiscalar power differential shape human mobilities on the ground. Next slide, please. And therefore, this is why we try in Habitable to look at intersectionality, to go beyond these limitations. So not only for academic and conceptual understandings, which of course it's an academic project, but it's an academic project that aspires to social change. And intersectionality refers to the interaction between gender, race, class, and other categories of difference in individuals' lives, social practices, institutional arrangements, and cultural ideologies, and the outcomes of these interactions in terms of power. Most of this is about power relations. It allows us to understand how norms, how values, how the division of labor within households, but also of labor markets, of course, fundamentally shape migration drivers and outcomes. And why is this key to habitability? Next slide, please. As I just said, so we aim not just to understand these drivers, but to try to change them. And if we don't understand what the root causes are, if we're stopping our analysis at who is vulnerable, how many people are exposed, that leaves us only halfway there, right? We need to understand what are the political structures that are shaping inequalities. And therefore, once we understand these, that's how we can aim to transform them and move from description to analysis. Because without understanding them, we risk indeed to make the situation a lot worse. And also intersectionality is not just about an academic concept, a theory, it's also about a method. It aims to transform the way that we do research. So far too many of these conversations take places in rooms like these in the global north. without many of the people that are involved and that suffer these consequences firsthand. So, there's this slogan, not about us, without us. And of course, these conversations are vital, but we need also to start thinking about how we're shifting power relations within the work that we are ourselves doing, and how is it that those voices can be more central to these debates, and that intersectionality also aims to do that. And of course, that's a bigger route for research in general, but it's also something that makes us think of these kind of limitations. Next slide, please. And realizing human rights protections, and this is really because we are here in the context of the Human Rights Council, but there is a danger in splitting gender, class, and race interests as if they were these social identity interests that create a lot of unfounded debates. Nobody is just a woman, nobody is just from Africa, nobody is just this. People are made up of all these complexities, and that's what makes people vulnerable or not in the situations of climate change. So by deploying these perspectives, we can better connect and understand issues of power, of privilege, of injustice within human rights frameworks, and not believe that we're going to find some kind of human right protection that's going to fit everyone, because none of them are the same. Next slide, please. To empower and transform. So our goal, of course, should not be only to involve and benefit marginalized individuals in the research we are conducting, which should be, of course, the minimum kind of requirement, but in the longer term, to empower marginalized people and contribute to transforming societies. So with these issues of gender and social equity, it's really just a way to look into power differentials and to try to understand them and to try to break those silos. Next slide, please, and I'm coming to an end. So the how, it's how we're doing it, and I won't go into a lot of the project details of how we're doing it, but basically gender and social equity are key objectives within the project. So every single work package is the lingo, but every single objective of the project should ask themselves these questions from the beginning of their research, but also when they're doing their analysis. So hopefully this is quite different across methods, different methods and different people have been able to integrate it in different ways. But hopefully the ambition is at the end, with the multiplicity of disciplines and of colleagues that we have in the Habitable project, that we will be able to shift the conversation in that perspective. And to conclude, just some reflections, which are that of course safe migration, not forced displacement, can be a crucial force for sustainable development. We've heard it today that a lot of people think that migration is a positive outcome, and indeed it can be. It can save lives, it can transform and challenge pre-existing social norms, and it can be an important adaptation strategy in the context of climate change. However, it is important to note that today migration is still falling very, very short of its potential for development, that a lot of this migration as adaptation is actually a way to instrumentalize migrants and to place on them the burden of climate adaptation. So we shouldn't allow that positive narrative, which is very important to kind of add insult to injury. Social injustice is not going to be solved by migrants moving in vulnerable situations, ending in exploitative jobs, which is oftentimes what we see in the countries that are mostly impacted by climate change. So we need to take an integrated approach to climate-related migration that prioritizes human well-being and the needs of the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized people, not the needs of some kind of economic transformation. And we believe that by understanding how gender and social inequities at multiple scales shape the climate mobility interactions, we can work together to address these social inequities and to strive towards transformative migration pathways. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And now, since this concludes the presentations from our project members before the conclusion from François again, we're going to open the floor once more for questions. Again, that would be for everyone who just spoke in this portion. That's Gianfranco, that's Dennis, and that's Sarah. So if you have any questions for any of these interventions, now's the time.
Thank you. Yes, I have two questions, maybe one to Gianfranco and one to Sarah. So you mentioned that the policy options that you're discussing are also like on a multilateral level. So I was interested in how far the current discussions on the European asylum law that are currently discussed have an influence on your work and on the assessment of them. And maybe towards Sarah, the question, so these kind of discussions that are now also like on a legal perspective also happen in society and change like social norms and how people perceive social justice. What do you think about it, and how far is this also relevant to like promote this idea of intersectionality? Thank you.
Gianfranco, do you want to start?
Okay. Thank you, Karin, for this question. And of course, the European level is very important for us, not only because, of course, it is an EU project. So, but you mentioned specifically the discussion on the asylum package. So, of course, it is something that we consider, we look at, but is something that should be perhaps developed and then modify the current legal framework. But we take into consideration this kind of discussion, but of course we cannot consider them as an option. We integrate some EU-level policies and regulation, for example, the climate regulation, for example, the adaptation strategy of the EU, for example, some practice of the EU, and of course, I think the most important is the most important area of free movement in the EU. So it's something that we have we take into account, but specifically with the protection side, I think that we should wait to see how the discussion goes on this specific issue.
Thanks for the very good question. And I think it's really kind of essential to consider the way that narratives do shape reality. So what is happening in the policy discussion, it shapes the material realities on the ground, because of course, if states present climate and migration issues as a security problem, right? They might there have political legitimation to invest in border control, in militarized climate interventions, etc., which not unproblematically is something that we have actually been seeing over the last years. And on the other hand, the positive side of the spectrum, which is they present it as an adaptation option, which is of course where we've aimed to push the debate so far. That can also come with unintended consequences, which is, and I see this more in Asia than I used to in Africa, but migrant exporting countries, which is really, actually, look, we don't have a lot of jobs, and it's fantastic that you're all moving to Thailand, to Malaysia, because this descends our unemployment. You send a lot of money back, and actually we want to promote this narrative. But of course, how many of them end up in irregular situations, being exploited, etc., that's not so much part of the picture. And having worked in both Africa and Asia, I find that quite fascinating, the way that the climate and security discourse is taken over here. Whereas in Asia, it's not at all. And actually, climate and migration seems not to be that much on the agenda, because economic inequities between countries mean that countries are for migration. Thailand, Malaysia, the powerhouses in Asia, they need cheap labor. And if climate change is going to do that by bringing more migrants, welcome be it. And of course, the poor countries that have a lot of unemployment, the governments as well. So in a way, I think that it's a very good question, the way that narratives about what this issue is and what the consequences are, they really do shape realities because they shape policy responses, which of course shape people's lives if they're implemented.
Go ahead, yes.
Thank you. Perhaps also to Gianfranco, you're now focusing quite a lot on messaging, at least in the discussions that we had today afternoon on the migration policy side of things. But in terms of the loss and damage conversations that are happening on climate change, like how this is, your findings are articulating with that strand specifically, right? Those are concerns for climate impacts, for the habitability of certain areas. And are you able to craft policy messaging or give policy recommendations about what the inputs to that specific work stream should be? Thanks.
Well, loss and damage, thank you for your question. Of course, loss and damage is something very new in the, relatively new in the academic debate and also in the international debate for with a climate migration perspective. But I think that loss and damage is very important, of course, for example, to support some human rights principle, for example, principle of access to justice, compensation. This is something that we should take into account, and this is something, in my mind, very useful also to promote habitability, in the sense that an equal compensation can help people to decide whether if he wants to stay or if he wants to move. So it's something that it is very important, not only in an economic sense, not only economic loss and damage, but also non-economic loss and damage. So I think there is something that is rising right now. There is the institution, the creation, the establishment of the loss and damage fund that we don't know how it will work, because it's something that is currently discussing. But it's something that could be very helpful in promoting habitability and promoting also human rights of people, not only after they decide to move, but also before. So in the sense they help in taking the decision. This is my...
We also have a response from Dennis on this question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is very timely and important. As part of our analysis, how financing, climate financing is already addressing some of the elements of loss and damage, that we can see that there are already some instruments used that can also be helpful on an overall loss and damage financing framework, and that I think also other research outlines that, for example, catastrophe bonds and can be of relevance here, micro insurance element that may be part of this overall toolbox at the end of the day. And there's also analysis by also the Frankfurt School of Business out there that some of the instruments that may be relevant for or could be most ideally relevant for the loss and damage funding has already been addressed by the Green Climate Fund funding. So I think there is already some at least initial evidence that they are not, that there are some parts speaking the same language or could speak the same language, and I think it would be also important to further see how this really on the ground is then in terms of social justice and also the aspects of intersectionality that, as Sarah outlined, they are really implemented in a way so that they can serve as good practices examples.
Thank you. We have a next question here. Yes.
Thanks everyone presenting, really, really interesting. I'd like to jump on, I've been stimulated now by bringing up that language of loss and damage, because I think the first thing that strikes me I've been following those discussions extremely closely, including in the transitional committee meetings, working on the loss and damage fund that you just mentioned. The whole premise of this project, the concept of habitability, has suddenly got even more value in the policy where there's a huge amount of attention right now. And there's a huge opportunity to try to influence the narrative indeed around what we're talking about in terms of human mobility, and particularly displacement as a form of loss and damage. And that discussion is about addressing loss and damage. So that was the party's decision. So it's less about the adaptation and even the preparedness, perhaps, depending on who you talk to, right? So it's very much about, this is the stuff we haven't managed to avoid. This is not good stuff. It is not adaptation. It's people who have lacked adaptive capacity, if you like. They're beyond their means, beyond their capabilities, beyond the access that they have to any kind of not just social support, but very much political support as well. So governance frameworks there. So I just want to, it's kind of a general question perhaps about how, given that this is such a strong stream now, that seems to make this evidence that you're all producing even more relevant, but from perhaps a different and complementary point of view as well. Whether that's even shifting some of those definitions, interesting work you did early on in definitions, glossaries, conceiving what we're talking about here. Is that shifting your thinking already in terms of how you're understanding or what this notion of habitability can even contribute? It's a bigger question. And also to Dennis, very interesting. And I was just wondering, because so you mentioned some really good examples of good practice, I think you were calling it. You mentioned, for example, the more recent Kampala Declaration, but I was also thinking about regional legal frameworks like the Kampala Convention. So the stuff that's existing, particularly around displacement, for internal displacement, Kampala Convention, or refugee, like regional frameworks. Is that something you've also been building in? Because something that I'm always looking for is to see that really comprehensive view across. You know, we still are struggling all the time, of course, on language, on concepts, and we know that they have political outcomes. It's whether it's drawing lines for data, drawing lines for policy and law around things which are almost by nature arbitrary, because you have to draw a distinction between things, right? We all know that. But I was just wondering if you're building in, whether through your work, Dennis, or others indeed, that broader frame that really tries to capture that range. You know, from UNHCR's point of view, we've talked about protection gaps, or what do we mean by that? Is it really a framework gap, or is it actually an implementation gap? Has your thinking even shifted since the beginning of the project around those things in terms of how you're all analyzing? Thanks.
To you, Dennis.
Maybe I can come in on exactly on the yeah, both questions are very, very important. I think the first one is with respect how this is changing also our work. I would say for the moment, I mean overall this is relevant for the way also we try to cluster maybe also the different spheres of policy options in a way, but still try being pretty much influenced on this strengthening of resilience as core part of the adaptation framework. So I think we are still at a moment where when we, for example, try to bring in the insights also from our case study countries, our stakeholders, that we try to be more aware to what extent those concepts are relevant for them, to what extent they are already bringing in some of the ideas that is with already ongoing loss and damage, be it in as outlined more from the economic but also from the social perspective, and what this also means for their agency in a way. I think that is pretty much where we also our scenario narratives are trying to build on in order to inform some future perspectives. When it comes to those regional frameworks, which I see also from the research as very important. I think we are still a little bit what we see is that in taken this as a multi-level game somehow, that is most often that we have this disconnect between those work of the regional or not necessarily a disconnect, but we need to try to connect what are there on principles and norms and really tangible options for activities inspired by the regional frameworks to bring this down to the a local level in being relevant for the everyday life and the overall opportunities at hand, and most often through the national level. And I think there we are still struggling a little bit if we can really say, I think from when it comes to the dimension of goal and goals and policy formulations, we most often see that they have quite important normative elements in there. But I think that was also the background to choose this policy cycle. Most often we lack the overall knowledge on how this is in fact then relevant at the local level. And there we hope also with our scenario workshops that we are structuring and then organizing at the moment to shed some light on in order to be more concise on what can be a good practice in this regard. I hope that helped to answer a little bit the question.
Yes, thank you. Sarah or Gianfranco, would you like to also contribute to this?
Perhaps I guess bringing the question back to you, I guess, because you're more in the policy conversations every day. Do you see that there is a good opportunity now that the conversation has shifted into the loss and damage mechanism versus a few years ago when that wasn't the case? And if so, in which ways? Because of course the concept of habitability, I think it's nice, it's catchy, but again, it's going to be quite difficult to define it precisely because what is habitable for some is not habitable for others, and in the same place, and you might consider a place habitable because you have social protection, because you have capital, and because you can remain in place, whereas you're one person 1 meter away from you cannot. So I think that it's going to be hard to give a clear-cut kind of definition, and in which way do you think that we could contribute? I guess bringing it back to you.
Back to me, thanks, Sarah. Intersectionality, differentiation. I mean, in those discussions, you hear different negotiating groups, NGOs, activists also intervening sometimes. But we ourselves are also saying, you have to get, I mean, you've all been highlighting beautifully like the different contexts and how it looks so different in different places and for different people, right? And so I guess one of the things that's been discussed are some of those principles that need to be brought into such a fund, right? So including indeed participation, consultation with all of those. I don't even need to finish the sentences, I know for this crowd, right? So that is so important, but highlighting up that evidence and showing it's not just a nice to have, but it's actually something that, why is it substantively really, really important here, right? So that's an opportunity. Where I think there can be a lot of confusion though is that they're trying to figure out a lot of concepts. And I know this is an ongoing debate around the use of these sort of migration, human mobility umbrellas. It comes down to it. You have to split that up. I mean, we all know everything needs to be put back together at the end of the day, and that's how community experiences, how we all experience life, right? Not in silos, hopefully. But yeah, I don't know how to say it quickly, but the need to when you're talking, you see in the policy discussions in relation to human mobility, adaptation, loss and damage, and now it's adaptation versus loss and damage because they're drawing a line. That's something last year. That was a decision that's putting it clearly on the agenda. Now you can shake your head and go, oh no, we're trying to make sure that these things, everybody knows they're connected. But like I said, in the policy field, this is the reality. They're having to draw, and it's the G77 in China that push for this. It's the most vulnerable countries that have pushed for this. They want explicit attention to the fact that they're already being seriously impacted today. It's not a future thing, right? And they want more support. And there's a major social political injustice, if you like, around that, right? And that's how they're framing it themselves. So there is an opportunity, absolutely, for evidence which is relevant for policy as it looks today, even if we don't feel that comfortable, frankly, so perhaps where the lines are being drawn. But still, that is the policy space. And that's why I think, that's why I'm kind of trying to provoke a little bit, if you like. This habitability notion, yes, we can take the adaptive capacity resilience point of view, but you also have to recognize where it is actually loss and damage, right? You can't ignore that. And yes, we're trying to create a more balanced narrative and recognize the positive as well, the negative. But man, we know the negatives are massive, right? So, and they're growing. And that's what all the, whether it's OCHA going in and presenting on the massively growing humanitarian funding gap. And this is not a fund that's supposed to be taking from a humanitarian pot, it's supposed to be new and additional, right, funding. So this is a huge opportunity. And I do think seriously that, even the framing of this project around habitability, not losing the adaptive capacity resilience side, hugely important, including, by the way, for people who are already living in highly vulnerable situations, displaced, refugees, conflict, fragility. Don't separate those things out. Look at them all in the round, right? There's a huge opportunity here. We're trying to push for that. The point about securitization of the issue, absolutely. It's very sensitive. However, it's also the reality in the policy spaces. How do we engage in that? For UNHCR, it's about trying to reframe it as human security, not just national security. Not seeing the people as the threat, but the people who are under threat, but also what they can contribute. So it is a mixed message, but we need to, all of us, whether we're talking about it from a more humanitarian displacement point of view or a more development, adaptive capacity migration point of view, if you will, we need to balance our dialogue. We need to figure out a way to tell this story that doesn't cut out different aspects. It's really hard. Many of us have been doing it trying to do it for many years. I don't know if that helps. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks. And if I can bounce back on this one, I think one of the issues with loss and damage funding in general and the architecture that's coming is about quantification, right? And it's about quantification of impacts, including all the impacts that are mediated through people's movement, right? So a little bit going into what Harald was presenting today, but what are the negative consequences of movement that are associated with migration, with relocation, with displacement, of course, even more than the other two probably. So that's something around which a notion of loss and damage needs to be articulated. What are the additional negative impacts that people suffer due to an initial climate hazard, but because they were displaced, because they had to move, right? Then there is an element of technical assistance. This is more kind of the Santiago network on loss and damage, but that part is about the technical measures that we can take before, during, and after in order to reduce those impacts potentially. So it spills into adaptation, disaster risk reduction, preparedness, but it's going to be there in one way or another. So we kind of need to understand what are the context-specific migration and displacement-specific elements that we can apply into whatever type of interventions happen by national governments, local governments, international organizations, etc. And then to me, there is another point, which is the element of justice that needs to come up when we're talking about migration in this space. Because there are very clear historical responsibilities for these impacts. There are very clear historical responsibilities for countries that have created the conditions for inhabitability to happen and now are creating the conditions for migration not to happen. So these are things that from a non-institutional level need to come out much more strongly, I think, than they are now. So in a way, migration needs to be framed as a form of compensation itself, migration opportunities, right? And that's not happening. And of course, it's super sensitive for all policy spaces, but we need to articulate that evidence that you have in terms of shaping up bigger mobility options and improving the conditions of those that are on the move as an issue that helps address those. And that's the responsibility of those that have caused those initial issues to address, right? So that's, I think, a third layer that it's not going to be raised by UN. It's not going to be raised by donor countries. It needs to come from other spaces, and an evidence-based narrative around that, I think, could be really useful.
Thank you so much for these excellent questions. Do we have any other questions for the panel before we conclude? Well, on that note, I again would like to express gratitude to everyone here for being such an engaged audience. It's been a great day of presentations from the colleagues of Habitable. And I would now like to pass the floor again to François Gemène, our principal investigator, for the closing.
Thank you very much, Claire. Everyone in this room knows that I'm no big fan of cocktail parties, so I'll try to take as much time as possible and then head straight back to my hotel. Well, first of all, let me thank all the presenters for providing us insights into what they've been doing in the past few weeks, months, and years. Those of you will remember 12 years ago the publication of the Foresight report. And those of you will also remember the strong policy impact that the Foresight report had. In particular, the fact that this is really the report that put the idea of migration as adaptation on the policy map, which later translated into meaningful policy decisions, programs, and projects. I certainly do not want to compare us with the Foresight report in the ambition of the endeavor, but still, we are still a major research project connecting a large number of research centers and institutes working on this issue. And clearly, the topic, from a policy viewpoint, remains as important as ever, especially now that discussions on loss and damage are really kicking in, as some of you have reminded us. We really need to reflect on how we can inform these policy debates and how research results can actually transform and translate into practical, concrete policy orientations and policy results. And for this, we will need your help. I think that what really created such a policy impact around the Foresight report was not just the quality of the report in itself, but the fact that the report was supported by a wide research and policy community, that it was not just the report commissioned by the British government, but that it was a report to which a lot of us had contributed, supported, and were ready to bring forward into policy circles. We will need, I think, to achieve the same kind of results with Habitable, which means that we will need to continue further and deepen our conversations with the wider research and policy community in Geneva, in New York, and in all policy circles where decisions are made. And it is absolutely essential that we target the right policy questions, those where decisions can be made or will be made, and that we bring answers to these questions. As of today, even though climate change appears as a key policy priority on, it seems, everyone's lips, the situation in the Mediterranean has not changed much. Yesterday, there was another wreckage with more than 40 lives lost at sea. I don't need to remind you that 10 days ago or so, more than 500 lives were lost at sea, and that the death count since the beginning of the year amounts more than 1,500 drowned migrants. And I am often shocked to see that many of the discussions on climate change in public debates do not really mention this. I am shocked that many of those radical activists or influencers online seem to be alarmed by the fact that temperatures have hit 50 degrees in Pakistan or that there is a major drought in Spain, but basically don't say a word about those drownings in the Mediterranean, as if the goal was, you know, to keep the climate stable for the sake of climate stability, without any consideration for the people who might be pushed away from their homes by the degrading environmental conditions. Obviously, now as climate change has reached the top of the policy agenda, I think we need to provide a stronger effort for migration to also reach the top of the policy agenda. And the problem is that when it reaches the policy agenda, it is in terms of border closures, most of all, and that for those who would be inclined, I would say, to a more liberal or progressive stance when it comes to migration, many of them seems to be happy to turn a blind eye on what's happening currently and focus on climate change only. I think it is absolutely crucial that we bring those two issues together and that we remind that at the end of the day, the goal of fighting climate change is to keep the Earth uninhabitable, and that if it is just fighting against climate change just for the sake of the climate, well, you know, count me out. Therefore, we, I think, need to produce a stronger effort as a research and policy community. And I think that one of our strengths is that we know each other so well, and that we get along with each other so well, and that I know very much that we're all pretty much on the same page when it comes to these issues. And I think that we need to produce a stronger effort now, perhaps more than ever. Habitable can be a vehicle for this. I'm sure there are other research projects, other policy initiatives, which can also be vehicles, but it is important that we connect those initiatives with one another. It is very important that we stand together also, I think, as a community, because when it comes to climate-induced migration in public debates, I haven't seen much evolution. Migration related to climate change remain presented as a threat or as a risk that can still be avoided in the future. If we are to make a concrete impact with this, I think the dimensions that we touch upon in the project are absolutely essential, because those are the dimensions that will allow us to actually steer the policies into a direction that would help keep the Earth uninhabitable. And for this, I think we as Habitable, there are two things that we ought to do in the immediate future. Is one, how to gather the insights we heard today into a kind of compact, consistent policy document that can be brought forward to the wider community. So that, in a nutshell, everything we discussed this afternoon can be condensed in a kind of short 15 or 20 minutes presentation or 4 or 5 pager. That is something important, something that would need to happen before COP28, I think. And two is to really multiply the bridges between the different projects and see how Habitable resonate with other projects and other initiatives, and basically make sure that our results are not standalone results. And this is, I think, what made the strength, the policy strength of the Foresight report, and that should serve as an inspiration for us as well. And on this note, I want to stress that all data produced within Habitable will be open access data, and that all the quantitative data will remain for years accessible to the wider research community. So I really want to encourage you to use those data. This is in no way plagiarism. This is the reason we are funded. So those data will be made available, use them, tweak them, use them in another way, and perhaps you will find some other results that we haven't seen. Perhaps you will be able to ask other research questions, coming up with other answers. So really, this is a material that we'll be putting available freely to the research and policy community. Finally, I want to thank Florian very warmly because Florian has really been the driving force between the organization of all of this and of tomorrow. He has had to handle with the catering, with the processing of accreditation and all these nitty-gritty details that I'm so glad to be relieved of. So thanks a lot to Florian for all of that. And now it's time for the cocktail. Thank you.